Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me okay? Hi there. Welcome to the Tuesday, August 15th, 2017 meeting of both the Urban Village Development Commission and the PPC. Thanks for showing up. I'm sorry I wasn't at the last meeting, but just want to open the meeting, call the meeting to order, but I just do want to say that the purpose of this meeting is for us to jointly discuss the end of the development agreements, as we all know. And we have 3 agenda items tonight that we're going to try and stick pretty closely to. So if you could work with us on that, we'd really appreciate it. So at this time, I'd like to go ahead and open the meeting at 6:32 and welcome you all here. Thank you. Do you want to say anything before I go to the minutes, or no?
No, do the minutes first.
All right, so at this time, again, I wasn't at the last meeting, but we're going to go ahead and look at the meeting minutes from the last meeting. And are there any comments, clarifications, anything we want to talk about of significance tonight before we approve them? No. So I'd like to take a vote, and all in favor of approving the minutes from last meeting, which would be August 1st, I believe?
Yes.
All in favor? Aye. Aye. All opposed? Okay, passed unanimously. And let's go ahead and move on to the agenda items. We're going to start with Lucy Sloman. This first one is the Urban Village Replacement Regulations, the proposed regulations. Thank you, Lucy.
So there's a sign-in list. If anyone wants to speak, actually, I'm going to put it over here.
Yeah, to that point, we will have public discussion for each of the 3 agenda items tonight. So feel free to sign up for your public discussion at that time. Thank you.
And we would ask that you focus your comments on that agenda items and not speak at on different topics. And you can also feel free to sign in if you just want to be kept in the loop and not speak. There's a place where you could just check to be sent the materials. It is a joint meeting. This is for the UVDC as sort of the holders of history, but we've asked PPC to join because we know this is really complex, and we thought it would really benefit everyone to have a joint discussion as we move through the materials. Jennifer is going to hand out, we've received 2 letters which were forwarded to you. If anyone would like a hard copy, just raise your hand and we have hard copies for you. Okay. So I have the plan for agenda item number 1 is I have a brief introduction that's just kind of an overview of some of the code pieces, but primarily it's for you all to ask questions, make comments, identify concerns. So just to give you a little history, the development agreements are the build-out periods are coming to conclusion. As you can see, in May, the Talus build-out period ended. So in April, we began meetings with the HOAs of Talus and Issaquah Highlands. April and May, we met with the communities. We made a presentation to the City Council Land and Shore Committee, and then went away to work based on the conversations that we'd had. And August 1st was our sort of introductory meeting. Just to make sure that we're all familiar with the areas we're talking about, the yellow line here indicates the Talus project area. The red is the Issaquah Highlands project area, with the exception that green is the WSDOT TDR development agreement area, and the pink is what is called the TOD, or transit-oriented development, where the YWCA and Z-Home are. We have proposed to include those 2 development agreements in the closeout. They don't actually have to end now. They aren't through their build-out period, but they are completely built out except for the Bellevue College property, which is not included in this termination of the development agreement. Feel free to ask questions if you have them as we go along.
Actually, I do. You said they don't have to end now. What do you mean by that?
Their build-out periods extend for several more years. But
so you're not talking about the agreement itself, but you're talking about their specific development, their specific
so
agreement.
Development agreements don't just end when we reach the end of the build-out period. Some party has to take an action. So Port Blakely has asked to terminate the Issaquah Highlands. The city has asked to terminate Talus. And because we're going through this work, and those areas, the Pinecrest, Sunridge, YWCA, Family Village, and Z-Home are all built out, we thought, why not just do them at the same time so that we are thinking comprehensively about all of them. So this is the same, virtually the same graphic I used last time, but I think it may be a good starting point to think about of the broad range of things that are included in the development agreements, what are we proposing to do? So there are certain pieces that we're just proposing to terminate. The main body is basically the contract. It's the sort of central piece of each development agreement. Capital facilities are, improvements that between the city and the master developer, there was an agreement to build or provide certain things. Same with the master transportation financing agreement. It was certain road and transportation improvements. And then the quarry, which Issaquah Highlands used to have a quarry in it. So we don't need those standards anymore. The second bucket of replacement regulations, we're proposing to use the Issaquah Municipal Code. And that's because we feel that those standards are ubiquitous enough, generic enough that by using the Issaquah Municipal Code, we are not changing the character of either of the urban villages. Central Issaquah standards. Central Issaquah standards are kind of an outgrowth of the urban villages. We started with Issaquah Highlands, then we added Talus, then we added TOD, WSDOT TDR, Raleigh. And by the time we got to Raleigh in 2011, we had learned a lot of things over that sort of 10 or 15 year period. We incorporated those into the Raleigh Development Agreement. When Central Issaquah standards were written, since Raleigh is on the valley floor where Central Issaquah is, that was our starting point. So a lot of the sort of basic tools that we used in the urban villages were also applied to the Central Issaquah standards. And so we're proposing using those standards that, again, we don't think will impact character. We're proposing to use the Central Issaquah standards. The fourth bucket are things that we think are important to the character or in which we don't have standards elsewhere in the city that we think will serve the urban villages. So those are goals and objectives, urban design guidelines, land use standards, park and plaza standards, trail standards, UNER standards, and processing. Just a little bit of the processing. Any questions? So what I'm going to do now is I have 3 slides. I just want to talk to what I think are some of the notable elements that I just want to call out. No one may have any questions, or you may want to wait until we go through the actual code, but I just wanted to highlight these. So the first thing we're proposing is creating a new section in Issaquah Municipal Code 1819B. That's divided into 4 sections: an introduction, a section for Issaquah Highlands, one for Talus, and another one that applies to all of these urban villages whose development agreements are being terminated. The second thing is that we're taking the goals appendices, which are Appendix A in both agreements, and the urban design guidelines, which are Appendix B and Appendix S, and we're just carrying those forward. We're not making any changes other than incorporating any modifications or any revisions that were adopted during the course of the development agreement. And I think there's maybe none at Talus and maybe 3 or 4 at Issaquah Highlands, so it's relatively minimal. The third thing that we're doing is in the city, we have a zone called community facilities. And anything that is owned by the city, the school district, East Side Fire and Rescue, those kinds of organizations, that gets community facilities zoning. And there are three subsets of that. There's one for facilities, there's one for open space, and there's one for recreation. The privately owned land, such as it's owned by the HOA, that land is not publicly owned, but in a way, it is kind of like being publicly owned. And so what we proposed was creating comparative zones that have a PO suffix to the subset, so that the land that is owned, for instance, by the homeowners association will be clearly identifiable, people will know where it is and what the limitations are on that property. Fourth, we're creating new standards, one for sort of single-family and townhomes. This is not where it's a multifamily project, but for units that are on individual lots. The city doesn't have a lot of standards for those, and at Issaquah Highlands and Talus, we've done a lot of work on where garages are, how driveways are laid out, where the front door is. It's mainly around those kinds of elements. So most of the design on the single-family lot is up to the Architectural Review Committee. But for certain elements that we have regularly put plat conditions on, and which we feel are an essential part of retaining the character, we have proposed standards. We also have VUNERF standards. That's what the pictures at the bottom of the screen are for any of you who weren't familiar with that term. This is a shared use surface that pedestrians and cars share. There's a couple of different types. Every single one of these 4 urban villages has at least one VUNERF, so it seemed important to have those standards. We have worked with East Side Fire and Rescue and Public Works Engineering. They both reviewed the language that is in the proposal. And finally, we are retaining the home occupation standards. These are uses that are allowed in single-family homes. The city of Issaquah and the urban villages have somewhat different standards. And at this time, we may in the future propose combining those, but because these are businesses and it just seemed important not to change the rules at this time without being able to have a bigger, separate, focused conversation with people who would fall under those rules and might have concerns about those changes. Any questions about these so far? We can always go back. This bundle of notables is related to open space plazas and parks. So we have done an initial take on existing parks in all the urban villages, and we're saying that these would be retained, that these are a basic part of the character, as well as 3 plazas in the Issaquah Center, Town Center. Those 3 plazas were a requirement on Port Blakely, and so we felt that it was important that those also be retained. And what we're saying is that these are important enough that it would take council action for a change to any of those identified parks or those 3 plazas. Second, trails. We think that the major trail system in both communities, the master trails plan in Talus and just the general trail system in Issaquah Highlands are also an important part of the pedestrian orientation and connectivity. For those, we would allow adjustments, but it would require public notice. So there are adjustments of standards or adjustments that are allowed to just be done administratively without public notice, and we're saying no, that for trails to be changed, we would sign and notice that this proposal had been received so that we can have a public discussion about that before any trails are changed. Third, because not all the properties are developed, we have proposed a certain square footage per dwelling unit of park to be provided for those new projects. These numbers are provisional, but they are based on an accounting that we did. We're going to go back through and confirm these numbers, but before we went to that secondary effort, I wanted to have the conversation with the commissions and the community. But these numbers basically are an outgrowth of an average per dwelling unit across each of the two projects. Likewise, the city has come to require that non-residential projects outside the urban villages provide plazas. And so, or other kinds, they contribute, they pay impact fees for towards the park system, because we feel that that's not just a residential thing, but that people who work and live in a community, visit a community, also use it. And so we used 2 of the plazas that are in Grand Ridge Plaza as the basis for developing this number, just because it's kind of odd, the 1,200 square feet. In the development agreements, the conversion between a dwelling unit and commercial is 1,200 square feet. It's called an equivalent residential unit. Yes, Michelle?
Is there a reason why we're focused on Issaquah Highlands for that last point?
Well, I thought about that as I was writing this up. So right now, I think we were thinking because they had non-residential entitlement that had not been built. But I think that's a good question. Right now, Parcel 17B at Talus already has an approved land use permit. So if they built that permit, this would not apply to them. But if a different use or a different land use came in, and that's a good question. I mean, if we feel that's important, we can do that as well. You know, I think the one question I'm going to have is I have to think about what would I base that number on, because all these numbers are based on existing facilities to carry that same character forward. I'll have to think about what we could use as a basis at Talus. Okay.
Lucy?
Yeah.
You may have just answered this to some degree, but I want to ask it in a different
Sure.
way. On point 3,
Yep.
is that a change, up or down, from
No,
what we
that's a great question. Thank you, Jeff. Issaquah Highlands has never had a number. But you may remember, as we've gone through plats over the years, there have been questions from the commission, and I have, without the use of GIS, calculated the size of the parks and the sort of the average of that. So, but now, with Minions and GIS, they were able to more easily update all of that information. So Issaquah Highlands never had a number. We have calculated numbers at various times in the plats to just show whether someone was in the ballpark, but it was not a regulatory thing. Talus, on the other hand, the original development agreement required 100 square feet per dwelling unit, but trails counted towards that. And with the first amendment to the Talus development agreement, that requirement was removed. So, and yet, all the projects afterwards did provide open space as well. So that's why it's 150 and not 100.
Okay, thank you. And then similar question to point 4. I think you may have answered that in that that's based on what you know in the Highlands today. You're just going with that number. Is that correct? Or
That's the starting point. I mean, we can have a conversation about whether that's the right number or not. We, as you know, we've said, we're trying to carry the character forward. Those are that's the amount of space that has been built in Grand Ridge Plaza, the one that's kind of south of the wetland on Franklin, and then the one that's between the cinema and Big Fish. So that was the basis for this number.
Okay, and that's 1,200 square feet of actual development as opposed to land, the actual
Yes.
land, correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right, thank you.
So Lucy, why was that removed from the Talus agreement?
I don't remember the history, maybe you do.
So I'll give you a different take. So the 1,200 square feet is analogous to the water usage of one single-family house. So that's how we came up with that conversion rate, is it's an infrastructure capacity demand. And so by allowing it to go back and forth, we knew that we would have enough infrastructure in the Highlands. When Talus came along, Talus is much more geographic specific to land uses, whereas the Highlands was much more of an open book, and we needed to have a little bit more flexibility for uses kind of landing anywhere. Whereas Talus was very much single families here, multifamilies here, and commercial is here. So there's a lot less flexibility in the Talus agreement overall, because it was a choice of the master developer to have more predictability and less flexibility, whereas the Highlands wanted a broader amount of flexibility in their agreement. But as Lucy said, if at the end of the day, the commissions are going to recommend a change of land use for the Talus commercial space, that 1,200 square feet is what we would use to figure out how many residential units you could get out of 500,000 square feet of office space.
Is this the plot at the bottom, at the entrance of Talus?
It
To
is.
the left, or to the
The south side.
south side? So
Kind of in front of Timber Ridge.
So could that be converted to a commercial area? Is that what I'm
So
hearing?
it's commercial now. It has 510,000 square feet of commercial entitlement. And what was envisioned was an office project. But what the property owner has found is that finding an office user for that location has been very difficult for the past 10 years. And I think they'll talk about that a little bit more later in the agenda when we get to those individual requests for land use changes.
Scott, why don't, feel free to come up. Can you put Scott's plate? Thank you, I just saw you. Thanks, Jennifer. So any other questions on this slide before I go forward? So the last one is kind of a process slide. One was the idea to shift the Urban Village Development Commission work to the Development Commission. It's not that we don't like the Urban Village Development Commission.
Exception to that.
I figured you would. But, you know, as many of you know, we've met very rarely this year. We do have a couple of permits coming up later this year, I think 3. But the thing is, after those permits, we're not sure how frequently it will happen. And so we're just wondering if it makes sense to continue to have you making yourselves available if we're not meeting very frequently. Lastly, you may or may not be aware that in the development agreements, there was many things that could be changed administratively if both the master developer and the city agreed. But there was a small group of things that could not be changed unless the council was part of the decision or made the decision. And so we are carrying several of those forward as part of this. So if the zoning was to change on a piece of property, if the overlay or entitlement, you know, the amount of things they could build, the land uses, increasing heights, removing or reducing parks and plazas, as we mentioned, or using TDRs. Those are the things that we are proposing would require council action to move forward.
I have a question, Lucy, about the first point, and that is to say, we keep mentioning, you know, the ambiguity of what will happen to a semi-defunct UVDC versus now the Development Commission, what is now going to PPC. What are the options on the table for that? What is the plan in place, or at least the options for how things are going to be dealt with? Are we forming another Development Commission in a sense and splitting the size of plats? I mean, I don't know that they actually have room on their plate to be able to be starting to take on anything that comes up in the future, how is the city measured, the workload, and how it's going to get divided up?
Well, it's a good question, and so to some extent, you may have noticed that everything had draft on it. So, we are bringing this forward to start a conversation with the community, and then there's a month before we meet again, which gives us an opportunity to go away and digest and think about this. I think one of the things I would say about the Development Commission is I believe in their bylaws they can have 2 different groups if they, so, that's one of the things we may talk about. Do UVDC members get folded into Development Commission and then we have a bigger commission? Do we keep the Development Commission and we increase the number of members and see who applies? We haven't really taken that the next level because we wanted to have this first conversation.
Okay, thank you.
So, lastly, just to lay out the calendar, the Issaquah Highlands build-out period ends in September. These development agreements, the ending of these development agreements are at a council work session September 11th. Our final meeting, proposed final meeting with you guys is September 19th, then with a public hearing at the Planning Policy Commission September 28th. October and November, working with Land and Shore Committee, the Council Land and Shore Committee, with a tentative adoption date in December, but it would not go in effect until 2018. So that's the end of my presentation. We can do a number of things. We can have general comments. We could go through page by page. It's really up to the commission how you'd like to use your time.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to take input. I personally think that it's helpful to have public comment before we go into further discussion, but I'm open to other ideas. Okay. So if there's not any objection, I'd like to ask that public comment be open at this time.
No, that'd be great. We just want to make sure it stays on the general topic.
Yep.
Yep.
So if you wouldn't mind, if you haven't signed up, please make sure we get your name and address. When you do go to the microphone, I don't know if somebody's going to hand me a list to call names or if you just go up in order, but if you give us your name, your address, and please stay on topic, and if you can keep it to 2 minutes, that would be great. Is there anybody who would like to speak at this time during public comment?
My name's Tia Heim, and I am with Shelter Holdings, 11624 Southeast 5th Street in Bellevue, and we own property in Issaquah Highlands. Writing a whole new zoning code based on an entirely new concept is a huge undertaking, and we understand that the city has a lot on its plate right now with other work items as well. But our feeling was that this draft appears very rushed or is a very early draft. And I guess we wanted to make sure that you guys understand that there's no time frame required by the development agreement itself for adopting the new zoning. Now, that doesn't mean you don't ever have to do it, but it does mean that you can take the time that you need to do it right. We have a few concerns with the draft that has come out, and I'll walk through a few of them. One is that you've taken an inconsistent approach to assigning the land use designations, and our property was unfairly singled out as the only property that is being proposed to have a forced conversion of certain of our entitlement rights. So we have residential rights that staff is proposing to convert to commercial. If you were following exactly the approach that was outlined, that where the new zoning designation matches the existing entitlement, our property would be designated mixed-use residential rather than mixed-use no residential. It also appears that the list of uses within each broad category has been significantly narrowed, but it's really hard to tell which uses were removed and why, because the terminology is different, and it also doesn't match the terminology in the existing code or in the SIDS. So we'd look for more information on what went into that and why you aren't taking the approach, or maybe you will decide to take the approach to match the code so that it's easy for a user to come in and say, you know, I want to do this use. I can look and I can see the zones that I could potentially locate in. It appeared that our property didn't have a neighborhood designation, so that made it a little unclear for us as to which design standards would apply. And then the default being the SIDS, or the Central Issaquah Design Standards, seemed odd and inconsistent with keeping the look and feel of Issaquah Highlands. A broader comment is that I think the proposal gets overly complicated and creates land use designations that possibly aren't needed. So the urban village mixed use non-residential isn't really needed when you look at how few properties are zoned that way or are proposed to be zoned that way. You could wrap those properties either into a commercial, a retail, or a mixed-use residential zoning designation. The way that it's proposed, with the overlay being the method of restricting the amount and type of land use, you can leave more flexibility in the zoning because you have that restrictive part in your overlay. So having all of these patchwork of zoning across sort of what's roughly the town center area gets confusing. So you've got things like, you know, the storage facility is proposed to be UV MUNR, and it could be commercial or it could be mixed-use residential. The dentist in Carter's is another one that gets that UV MUNR designation that really doesn't need it. Also the Zoomies in Seattle Suntan, the Port Blakely office, and our property. So we just think there are ways to zone those that are simpler and leave opportunity for redevelopment in the future without having little pieces of development zoned differently. So we hope that you consider those comments as you have your discussion tonight.
Thank you, Tia. Appreciate it. Patrick Mullaney, is that correct? Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to comment. I am here tonight representing Shelter Holdings. I'm a land use attorney in Seattle. My address is 1111 3rd Avenue. And Shelter asked me to go a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of some of the proposed changes. And to begin with, there are changes proposed for the parks and the plazas. And what we would request is that the commission also recognize the existing mitigation. Shelter does own a very large parcel up in Issaquah Highlands. There was a significant investment made in parks, traffic, and fire police mitigation that was already provided, and that should be somehow accounted for going forward as new development occurs. Echoing Tia's comment about, we'd request that the city be clear about what's being changed from the current uses. For example, the new commercial zone doesn't appear to allow storage, and that's a storage use, and that's an existing use that's allowed under the commercial zoning. Lucy mentioned that there are a lot of buckets, and there certainly are, and that's one of our concerns. Some stuff comes from the IMC, some comes from the SIDS, and some comes from the new standards that have been proposed. And when I took a look at it, it looked like there was a little bit of confusion and inconsistency between the buckets. For example, if you look at the UV comm use and the UV retail use, the uses themselves don't match up. So for a fitness center, that could be an indoor recreation use in the retail zone, but it would be a fitness use in the commercial zone. And under the existing IMC code, that would be a health fitness club. And so we just asked that as the uses get defined, that there be consistency across the various buckets that are being used there. So under the existing table for commercial zoning, it doesn't appear that any retail uses are allowed, and we just question why that is. It seems like in many cases, for instance, you might have an office building, but you might want to have a cafe or some other retail component in that. And so why is it that there's such a separation? Another kind of thing that it really doesn't impact us directly, but again, it highlights kind of the confusion in the uses. In the commercial zone, the UV zone, you can have a private or public school, but if you're in the retail zone, you only get a private school. And so we kind of wonder why those things are inconsistent in that way. And then my last comment is that it looks like that for in Issaquah Highlands, that every permit is being sent to the Architectural Review Committee for Issaquah Highland, which appears to be a large expansion of their current role. And I guess the concerns on that are twofold. Number one, that's a private HOA group. It isn't the city, and there are some permits that don't have an architectural component to them. And so our question is, how would that work, or what do they do, or why would they be involved, and how? So those were the more specific comments, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Karen Porterfield.
Karen Porterfield, 2498 Northwest Stony Creek Drive. I am a homeowner in Talus. I serve on the Talus HOA board, but I'm here tonight as a private citizen. I'd like to start by thanking Lucy and the city. They have been very informative in working with myself and all of my neighbors to help educate us on what this process is. And I am here tonight to speak in support of what the city is putting forward for Talus, which is retaining the underlying zoning in the still-to-be-developed property, and through that underlying zoning helps protect the character of Talus as we have it. It also, I'd like to point out, forwards the goals of the city of Issaquah by supporting the Central Issaquah Plan by driving dense housing, the higher density housing, into the core, as has been envisioned by the mayor and the city council. So we are very supportive of also achieving that goal. We do have one property, the infamous property number 9, where we would like to support what had been an original application, which had been for medium density townhomes versus high density. We feel given what has gone on that site, the character of the community and what the community's expectations had been by many people who moved in, we would like to support continued consideration of that density at that level. So I'm here tonight to support the city, to thank Lucy and her crew for all of the hard work they have done in reaching out to our neighbors and helping us work to maintain the character of Talus.
Great, thank you very much for your comments. Thank you, Jeff.
I saw you looking at it. So. Hey, good evening, everybody. I'm Jeff Wilfong, and I'm the Talus HOA board and also the architectural chair for Talus. So live at 530 Timber Creek Drive Northwest, and we've been in Talus now for about 4 years. So much like Karen, I wanted to come in and say that we're in support. You know, both Lucy and Keith have gone quite a bit out of their way to spend time, I know, with me personally as well as with the board about what's happening. And you know, so we're in support as well. We had a lot of conversation in our meetings about maintaining the character of Talus. That's probably our preeminent concern, is how do we handle this and keep the standards in place that will enable Talus to be what folks bought into when they came into Talus. So that's our leading concern. The slide, Lucy, that you put up that showed the 4 buckets, the one to the far right would be the one that we you completely support, and that is maintaining current land uses. From our conversation, we don't have the changes in land use like we're describing in the Highlands. You know, our expectation of this would be that we would keep things as they are intact, keep the land uses, keep the zoning. We like a lot of what we've been able to talk through with some improvements that would be made within the community. But overall, we're, on behalf of the HOA board, we're in support, and we're appreciative of where we are as of today. So thank you.
Thank you. Sarah Hoey.
Good evening. I'm Sarah Hoy. I'm the director for Issaquah Highlands. I'm here representing Issaquah Highlands Community Association, the IHCA. The board president and myself have met with the city of Issaquah Development Services on multiple occasions in regards to the end of the development agreement. IHCA's mission is to maintain the value of the properties and good quality of life for the residents in the community, which includes the rules, restrictions, CC&R's architectural review, maintenance of common areas such as parks and landscape, and we believe in the original vision of the community. Live, work, and play is our community mantra. It is IHC's job to ensure that whatever is approved by the city of Issaquah, that it serves the entire community and adheres to the IHCA guidelines and the architectural requirements. The IHCA Board of Directors remains neutral on this position on the proposed density and zoning changes at this time, and I've been asked to report back to them regarding this evening's meeting's content. We appreciate the hard work that the Development Services Department and I have been in partnership with, and we look forward to continuing our partnership. I would like to speak very quickly about the architectural ARC review process for all of the builders. I myself, with members of the builder ARC, oversee all of the development in Issaquah Highlands. Currently, we have closed out the Pulte project at Sunset, Aichi Joe at Sunridge. We're working with Toll Brothers and Polygon. It is an extremely intense process. We've retained the work of 2 architects, engineers, and landscape architects to review all the plans that come through. So they need our stamp of approval before they can go through the city process. I think that partnership needs to remain. Not only that, but we do inspections at post when they're done framing. We do construction site inspections. We do siding inspections to ensure compliance. We do final walkthroughs and make sure that everything has been done the way the builders have said they were going to build it. And then with that, we're able to approve and stamp out our final, and then the city can give back the bond money. So it's an extremely integral part of what I do, and I think it's absolutely necessary to the community of the Highlands to ensure that it is done properly. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sarah. And Eisman? Did I pronounce that right? Eisman, sorry about that. I should know that by now. I apologize.
Ken Eastman, 2473 Northwest Stony Creek Drive. I'm a resident of Talus. Just a couple of quick comments. I echo what my neighbors at Talus have previously said here at the microphone. I think most people in Talus want Talus to stay as it was originally designed and envisioned. The growth in Talus should be down in the central Issaquah area. I can tell you that I certainly support that concept. Residents of Talus are weary of development, weary of stalled development. We've got several pieces of development up there that don't seem to be going anywhere, not the least is because of the hillslides. So there's a lot of community concern about what will happen to the remaining parcels and will they retain the character and the original design This is certainly not a time to switch horses. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Michael Prunk.
My name is Michael Prunk. I'm in the Logan Park area, 2017, 31st Lane Northeast, there on top of the hill in the Issaquah Highlands. And I'm an architect, and I came dressed pretty casual tonight. But I want to express a few things. I've been involved a little bit with various groups in the Highlands and been there about 5 years and seen the growth. There was no retail when we first arrived 5 years ago, so that whole bottom of the hill has developed a lot. But I got involved a little bit. Shelter Holdings came in and asked for a little bit, some committee discussions with different private citizens in the Highlands. And so I joined one that's more near and dear to me, is one that's related to open spaces. And I feel sometimes spaces are left over and not intentional, that we have plazas that maybe are not gathering places for people to gather, let alone I live on an area kind of like a lone earth, but it's no dead end. It's a garden path, and in the back is an alley. And so I've gotten the neighbors. I'm the one that kind of gets the neighbors together, and it's amazing how people live there for 10 years and they don't know their neighbors. And so I've been the one once or twice this summer and gathering them together and block off an alley or so, just some sawhorses, and we get the neighbors together together. But I feel like there needs to be more gathering places there and very intentional. I think there's some of the things, that last opportunity, I think, for Shelter Holdings, bottom of the hill, all of a sudden you have a place that maybe could be a very vertical, mixed use, live, work, play. But I asked when we were talking about the open spaces, what kind of uses that they did, and they talked about some of the designs that we can integrate, a place where the mayor would maybe be able to speak and address the people. But they had such a variety of uses. They had an amphitheater, they had a senior center, they had plazas that would be there where we'd all gather, and that's where you would want the public to meet. I have my own opinions about shopping malls that are inside, and I think there's better places for people to meet or so that would be in plazas and places like that. I think of Europe. When I studied urban design a little bit for about a year, back in college, it was all about nodes and places where people can go from this activity to another one, and the experience between them. And you find that quite a bit in Europe. When you travel in Europe, you have that where just a piazza, there's a fountain, and all of a sudden you spend the night just traveling to another plaza somewhere else. And that's the great experience. And it really benefits all people or so too. But so it's kind of a passion of mine, and I'd love to see that intentional plaza and those gathering places, because I want to see my neighbors in other places other than heading to Bellevue. We went to, it was a Halloween one time, and we thought, oh, the mall's going to be empty, it's Halloween, everybody's going to be around the neighborhoods. They were all at the shopping center, at the mall, doing their thing there and not in their neighborhood. And I think we have that opportunity with these different urban villages. So, but I appreciate this time to express my views, but it is a passion. It's wonderful places where people can gather, and I'll create one of them back in my back alley, but I appreciate any public areas. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. So I don't have anybody else on the list that has indicated they would like to speak. Is there anybody else in the audience that would like to speak during this public comment section on this particular topic? First agenda item being the urban village replacement regulations. Somebody raise their hand. I'll ask one more time. Anybody interested in speaking at this time? Final call. All right, at this time, we will close the public comment section of this first agenda item. We will open it again for the next two agenda items. Thank you. So at this time, I would like to go into joint commission discussion and like to ask if anybody would like to ask any questions, follow up on any of the public comment or the staff presentation. It's pretty much open at this point. Yes, Lindsay.
Okay, so we have gotten a letter and comments now which have said this seems a little rushed, that some of the language in there doesn't actually feel like code. So I understand that this is a draft. We see that all over the place. How are we going to take it to something that feels like it could be codified and feels like it could be presented to council?
So I think that the land uses, we feel that there is an opportunity to go back and study some of the questions that have been raised. The storage area was an oversight. I thought that I was removing it from Talus and not from Issaquah Highlands, so that was my error. Not an intention. Bob Gregg, the owner of Issaquah Highlands Storage, has already been in and we've chatted, and so that'll be corrected going forward. So I think we'll go back and look at some of the uses. I think in terms of not being code language, I'm unclear what is not code language. So we can certainly have a conversation with Shelter Holdings and find out if they have specific examples. I don't think that we thought we did not write in code.
Okay.
Thank
So
you.
at the end of the day, and just one more thing, I mean, so before this ultimately gets attached to an ordinance and gets approved by the city council, the city attorney will review it in detail, and if there are any irregularities, hopefully he would find them.
And actually, this draft went to him, so.
Oh, good, that's what I was going to ask. Is there a way that he can review that maybe before we look at the next draft, rather than after us and before council? Is there a way to intercede that?
Well, I think before we go to PPC for the hearing, we did send it to him now, and that was actually going to be one of my calls tomorrow, is to find out at which point he wants to engage, whether he wants to just look at certain pieces now or review the entire thing.
Okay. I wanted to follow up on Lindsay's comment. You know, we had gotten that comment from the Builders Association as well, and it rang true to me that I felt this sometimes read a little bit like policy rather than code. One of my examples that I have here is on page 36. 1.3 is parks. It says, see the specific urban village for guidelines, locations of existing parks, and requirements. And I didn't really love that we're referring back to another section rather than specifying out. So either that, I think, needs to be removed, or it needs to be codified so that it's not, you know, either it can be deleted because it's a reference to something else that's already written in the code, or it needs to be actually spelled out what it is.
Okay.
So it's safe to say that everything we have in front of us today has not been vetted by the city attorney at this point. Is that correct?
Right. Just because we're trying to limit the number of times that we send it to him.
That's totally fine. I just want to make sure that
Yeah.
we're all on the same page.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I had one comment. Being the new person, this is, a little bit fresh to me, but I went through this packet the other day and made all sorts of notes. And one thing that did come up, there was some confusion on, I said, the note I wrote to myself was, bakery exists for both commercial and retail. What distinguishes retail? So there's a little bit of confusion just from my standpoint, why certain things get lumped into certain categories and others into others when there seems to be some duplication or overlap to it.
So it's a great question. Issaquah Highlands and Talus both very intentionally did not have just a commercial use. They had a very specific amount of square footage that was retail and a very specific amount of square footage that was commercial. So in part of carrying that character forward, we did not just bundle them all together. So to put retail uses and commercial uses into a single bucket, or to have a lot of overlap, seems to potentially create problems. Now, in terms of looking at the kinds of uses and the language between the two, I think that's a great question, and we will certainly go back and look at that further. But that was a really intentional action on our part to keep those separate.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I, for one, appreciate that they're deliberate and separate, because I think it's important not to munge those together and lose one over the other just because it's flexible to do that.
So, and I think so the land uses, there was definitely some staff subjectivity in changing the what's allowed. And so part of it is, think about it in terms of, you've got 400 acres and you've got 300,000 square feet of retail and 3 million square feet of office. And so you generate a menu of what could potentially be in those areas. Well, we don't have, and I'm speaking about the Highlands specifically because it's much more, I think, a factor there than it is in Talus, because Talus, again, like I said earlier, had less flexibility. But some of the land uses that were allowed in the Highlands, for example, a car dealership, before y'all moved into the Highlands, whoever lives there, that might have been a great choice for that location. But now you look at that community and you say, okay, well, would a car dealership actually fit in the Highlands or not? And so we as staff went through that land use list, and some of those things we plucked off because we thought, it doesn't fit the character right now. And, I think that's part of where we want you guys to engage, to say, no, actually a car dealership up there would just be awesome. If that's what you believe. So this is where
Tesla, maybe?
This is where we wanted to, try to engage you guys in some of those conversations where because you're the community, at the end of the day, you guys know this community better than we do. And so we make our best guess at some of those things that we think fit with the community vision. But if ultimately you say, we don't think so, we don't get it, then we can change it. That's what this process is really supposed to focus on. Things like technical code writing, that's not what this conversation should be about, because the city attorney and city staff will deal with those pieces. So I appreciate the highlights for you. If y'all see something that doesn't seem like it makes sense, we will flag that and direct city attorney to look at that. But that shouldn't be what we spend most of our time on here, because that's really not what this should be about. It should be more about substance and, where this thing lands at the end of the day.
And I mentioned this in my cover memo, but where you find typos, things that you think are awkward or unclear, feel free to just hand me your copies, and I will go through those and just take care of those edits so that we can focus on the more substantive pieces.
Okay, Lindsay.
So I've got, continuing on that conversation of commercial versus retail and the mixed-use retail and non-retail, if we look at the map of the Highlands, which is page 53 of 71, we do see quite a few different blocks in different colors. And for example, 53 which is the Carter's store, is mapped out as mixed-use non-residential, which obviously it's not. How were these decided?
So tell me, Lindsay, why you say that is not mixed use?
Because it's a retail store.
Actually in a dental office.
So it's a mix of commercial and retail.
Okay. So it's not stacked.
Vertical, it's
just
horizontal.
Yeah. Okay.
And I actually think that's kind of the beauty of, at least Issaquah Highlands. I can't speak so much for Talus because it's different, but having that flexibility to do different things in different places is nice.
But this somewhat codifies that out.
To some degree it does. I can't disagree with that necessarily.
I guess my question is, what happens if the dental office leaves, and does that limit what the potential is for the space?
Yeah.
Or
Good
vice
question.
versa.
Or vice versa?
It has to be from the commercial use category. So for example, a restaurant could go in lieu of the dental office. So it would have to be something from that commercial kind of land use menu. And if somebody wanted to do retail there, then the owners, Grand Ridge Plaza, would have to come in and ask for a change of land use if they wanted to put retail in where the dentist was.
So it's like a rezone.
Yeah.
But on that note, though, I happen to agree. I think where you're getting at is, why isn't it consistent? Why is that one little spot or a couple of different little spots, 54, 55, 53, why don't they all have the same designation and work collectively to be able to handle whatever is appropriate to come in there, right?
So,
Without speaking for you guys, I think that's just how I see it.
so I think that the approach was, that's why we're having a conversation. I think the approach was to focus fairly closely on what was there. So if everything on a piece of property was retail, it's retail. If everything is commercial, it's commercial. If it's retail and commercial on a piece of property, it got mixed use, non-residential. If it's retail and residential or non-resident or commercial and residential, it got mixed use residential. So it was trying to have the map communicate that variety. And, you know, that's a question whether that is
So the other choice would be, so if, for example, you guys decided you just wanted all of Grand Ridge Plaza to be retail, so what would happen with the commercial uses that are there now is they'd become non-conforming, okay, because they're not retail, right? Or we'd have to change the retail land uses to include like a dentist, right? So we could do that. And so there's choices in front of us, and part of this is not only making it make sense for staff, but it should make sense for the community as well.
Thank you for presenting options, because I think that's what we come down to, is looking at this going, oh gosh, that looks chunked up, and here are some potential consequences to that, but not necessarily knowing how we can mold that because of those consequences that we see.
One of the questions I have is if, let's say the dental office goes away and somebody wants to put a retail store in there, how daunting is it to get that zoning change?
Yeah, being able to allow some fluidity for the future, to have some flexibility for the community, rather than saying right now is what it is, and therefore you have to go through a whole slew. I don't know, but maybe there's a future where maybe Zoomies leaves and instead we have a spa there. I don't know that a lot of people in the community would so much, you know, really hate the Zoomies not being there. So allowing there to be some flexibility between these two classifications that all still fall under a non-residential use could be useful. A whole block in the area of saying they're commercial spaces, but don't necessarily have to be, but can be retail.
Yeah, it could be equally appropriate,
Yeah.
just a different type of use.
So I think we're talking a little bit apples and oranges, at least in my plannerly brain. So I'm going to try this and see if I can make sense of it. There are the uses that we can imagine in Grand Ridge Plaza, and that's a wide range of uses. The challenge is that each of those uses was built under a certain amount of entitlement, and that entitlement was different for commercial than retail. And that was intentional to the structure of the development agreement. We had talked to Port Blakely as we were getting towards the end of the development agreement to potentially have some uses that overlapped. They did not want to do that. And so we have kind of intentionally retained these two buckets. And so while we are not trying to put a corset on the future of either of these urban villages, we're trying to test the waters as to what will retain that character, the intention of the development agreement, without painfully constricting it going forward.
So, and one other thing to think about, so zoning is property and not person-based, right? So part of it is remembering that just because all of Grand Ridge Plaza is owned by one property owner now, doesn't mean that that's the way it's going to be 20 years from now. And so part of what we make decisions about should make sense regardless of how many property owners might own that entitlement at the end of the day. Because at the end of the day, each parcel could end up being owned by a separate retailer or commercial entity, and they may not care that, you know, something else is. So the flexibility that you might want to add in to allow it to evolve there could be some downsides. So, you know, we just need to talk that through a little bit more if that is indeed the intent that you all want to have. But right now, what this represents is, you know, contrary to, and I agree with Tia, I think the only parcel that is not exactly what it's entitled now is Shelter Holdings property, and we can talk about those 3 housing units and whether that matters or not. But, you know, for everything else, what is on the ground is what you see on this map. So if it shows up as mixed use, that means that a building or a parcel has both retail and commercial on it now. So.
Hi, so can you just confirm my understanding? So it sounds like that there are a lot of comments from the community that they want to kind of maintain what they bought into. That was more directed maybe to the Talus community, but I think it applies to the Highlands. So this is almost creating like a baseline or an as-is of the current state of the community, I guess, as far as zoning goes. And then we would build in some flexibility to change, but with the intent to kind of keep the same flavor, if you will.
You're hired.
Yeah, I think that's a good, that's a great summary.
Thank
And
you.
at the risk of
I'm not applying, by the way.
at the risk of sort of contradicting myself, I actually appreciate that we do have those separate designations, because I think back now, our earlier discussions years ago about what needs to go in there, and it seems very disjointed in the way we see it, because that's how it's played out. But you're right, entitlement for retail versus commercial versus other, we do want to make sure that everything is covered. And so maybe this is the best way to do it, but still have a path to make changes that aren't too daunting if it makes sense. Because I think to the average resident or the average visitor to the Highlands, they don't separate commercial versus retail, service versus sales versus whatever. To them, it's, you know, what's useful to them, what's valuable to them in the community, right? Whether it's an ice cream shop or a spa or a clothing, a tailor or whatever it is, right?
Right.
Especially when we think about the feedback we've gotten from the community about how prevalent chains have been in the Highlands and how many people want to start seeing a little bit more towards local, locally owned, kind of more of a mom and pop feel, and trying to be able to make that flexibility for those smaller businesses to be able to negotiate this rather than needing to be a giant chain with a giant force behind you to be able to even navigate that code of coming in. And so being able to see a future where maybe some retail spaces that become available are able to have some of that flexibility for when people talk about wanting to be able to stay in the Highlands for all of their different entertainment needs and everything that their family does. Right now, the Highlands doesn't offer that, and worrying about maybe the code being a constriction for that.
Well, you know, Regency probably owns, as of now, almost all the property. I mean, there's this parcel right here, and then number 6, and pretty much all the rest of this, including where Ladro is all owned by Regency. Now, Keith's absolutely right. Those can be sold off. I think that the code does not, I don't think, preclude individual, you know, it doesn't necessarily favor chains over mom and pop stores. I think the property owner may favor certain types of tenants. You know, part of the reason that we have an economic development department is to have a group that can help facilitate individual businesses finding a good home in the city of Issaquah. And certainly Development Services wants to help provide that kind of customer service as well. So I don't know that the zoning code precludes that. I think that with the feedback we're getting, we're going to go back and look at the uses and consider how, you know, the best method to try and do this, and we may come back with refinements, but I'm not sure that retaining the difference between retail and commercial is a huge leap for the individual businesses.
So I think what Joy is saying is if one of these spots that is commercial were to empty out and Regency was going to choose to fill that, they are much less likely to fill it with a small retail business if they're going to have to go back and do the zoning. So I think that is a point toward change. Have we received any comments from Regency?
No, I met with Craig Ramey, was in town. They're building on their last building of their entitlement is beginning next week, I think. And spoke with him and sent him all the materials. Haven't heard anything yet.
So I'll put my economic development director hat on for a second. So take a look at the land uses within each land use designation, and a lot of the things that you might think of as retail actually is also in the commercial land use section. So things like restaurants.
Crossover.
Well, and there's just, it's not always intuitive. And so we spent a lot of time, we spent over an hour today meeting with the owners of the commons today. And, you know, it's similar conversations to Town and Country and even the Front Street Market Shopping Center owners. Every retail owner in this city has a waiting list of not only retailers, but also restaurants and everything else. And so it's a great problem to have, and it's why so many of our retail property owners don't put a lot of money into their properties because they don't have problem leasing them up. So I guess what I would say to you guys is you may have preferences for certain retailers or businesses than others, but at the end of the day, it's the property owner who will make those decisions. And there's not a shortage of tenants looking for space in our community right now. We're a very sought after destination for many, both national and local businesses.
There were a couple of comments, Tia and Patrick in particular, that prompted me to write, apparently twice on my notes here, about grandfathered, like what is grandfathered? So Tia said something along the lines of if there is no action, you know, we don't have to rush into this. So my question is, if there's no action right now or in the foreseeable future, what is the state of things? Is everything grandfathered? Does it stay as is? What happens if we don't rush into a decision anytime soon?
So I'll just start by saying Port Blakely has put in a request.
That it ends by September, but it won't necessarily be effective until next year. So the cities received, so there's a different answer for Talus and the Highlands.
Okay.
So Port Blakely already sent us a letter from their attorneys saying, we want to terminate the development agreement by September of this year. Okay, so that's already out there. And so for Talus, we initiated the termination at Talus.
Okay, so let's start with the Highlands and say, if it doesn't, because we can't agree on whatever the decision is, what happens?
So
We will come to a decision.
So the administration would take forward a recommendation without the commission.
Okay. So
We're here to have
So
a
it-
conversation,
so it
and I
would-
think that,
yeah.
I don't think we've reached a impasse.
I'm not saying we do. I'm just wondering if it happens to take a little longer because we want to have a measured discussion.
Right.
And we want to come to a
So-
conclusion that makes sense for
Jeff,
all parties.
One of the things you missed
it
since you weren't here last time, so this is actually the second
You have to
discussion.
call me out on that, don't you?
Well, so you missed the piece that I said, which was, you know, Lucia initially had said, we think that we could do this in three touches. And the comment that I made was, we'll take as many touches as you guys want to feel comfortable with a recommendation going forward to the council. So,
Right.
so we initially set up 3 meetings, but I think based on where you guys want to be and how much you want to talk about this, you know, we'll go as long as you want, and it'll just mean special meetings that we'll call, and hopefully we can get enough commission members here to have a fruitful conversation. But
Yeah, and for the record, I mean, I don't think this should drag on for years and that, you know, someone should force a hand or whatever. I think there's a reasonable compromise that we can all get to.
Right.
I'm just curious, do things just continue as is until we get to that decision?
So, yes. Until the replacement zoning and code is in place, the development agreement is in effect.
so we may, I don't know. I mean, so for Talus, yes. For the Highlands, since Port Blakely has already requested it terminate, I don't know what happens if we don't adopt replacement regulations.
So I'm doing it from memory, but my impression is that, well, if it went for a long time, that would be an interesting question.
Their agreement, the Issaquah Highlands agreement, has an end date to it, correct?
No, it has a build-out period, and if no one did anything after the build-out period, it could just stay in effect forever.
It has
They
a
did it.
process to terminate.
Okay.
And Port Blakely initiated that process to terminate.
Gotcha, but they don't have a right, if they say we want it to end on September 30th, it doesn't have to end on September 30th, we have to have a process to make it happen, correct?
I don't know that it's that clear.
Okay, all right.
The meeting from the last meeting on 8/1 was really interesting in terms of there was pretty good feedback from commissioners of saying we'd like to see what is Central Issaquah and what is Highlands code language. Didn't really see a lot in this document that maybe was either colorified or, some sort of track changes or things to help us kind of understand. We talked about you guys kind of coming at it of trying to help bring us along your thinking, and part of that coming along to your way of thinking was to say, hey, how was this formed and where does this come from, I think? And I didn't really see a lot of that in this document. Is that still to come?
I think that just exploded our brains. I mean, it's hard to imagine how we would, in a succinct way, demonstrate that. So
Easier to do the opposite and to say, this is not Central Issaquah. Is it easier to do the reverse and to say,
So
where is there not an aligning?
So Lucy, I think what Joy's talking about, so go back to your 4 buckets slide, because I actually wrote that down, because I remember that from Carl and Ron.
yeah.
So that one?
Yes.
So I think that what was asked for, so I'm going to like the second column. So affordable housing, it says use IMC for that as an example. I think all that was asked for was a couple sentences of saying, why is staff recommending the IMC versus Central Issaquah or some specific development agreement provision? And I think we can do that. That didn't break my brain. I just forgot about it till now.
It's on your to-do list.
I think that was the thing, is going through this draft, I was hoping to be able to have some sort of clarification of saying, how much is this a change? We've heard tonight from the community, even though it was for Talus, I think it's an overall consensus of maintaining character and intent of how these communities were intentionally designed, and yet also seeing the other side of the process of how we've designed Central Issaquah very purposefully. And last time you had these really good examples of things like stormwater runoff, tree retention, and that some of the things are going to change for these communities, and very much so for a reason. Some of these things like setbacks are outdated information. It was really good information of why we need to realign to Central Issaquah, because that's our most up-to-date knowledge that we have to best preserve our communities. So going through this draft, it was interesting. I was hoping to even if it's a call out of saying this is what's different from Central Issaquah, might be easier than saying here's 2 examples, rather than running 2 different track-changing drafts. But to kind of understand where are we moving away from some of the original character that was in these development agreements versus how are we moving away maybe from Central Issaquah. So whichever way you approach it, being able to have this discussion, I think, is part of a dialogue of saying, how are we changing? Because I can look through this and be like, okay, yeah, that, we all love parks. Like, thank you for spelling out. And that's something that's been really important with UVDC that I saw in my work there, is really maintaining character and seeing how those really things that maybe other people may find to be minute make a huge impact on how we build our community. And so wanting to see kind of how those things align. It doesn't have to be line item by line item. That would blow my brain up too. But there was a huge comment about that from last meeting. So as this discussion evolves, maybe that can be a little part of it.
Sure.
And I had one other question that was actually about trails. Your slide that had about trails. Some of the work that that UVDC does is really good about integrating maybe what the developer sees as being how they want to use it and how the community is actually using that land. And it's come up several times, and I'm happy to say that a lot of times we've been able to integrate those two differences to be able to have things like right-of-way and kind of change the concept of trails in the Highlands. So I was concerned about existing trails being labeled because for these properties that I don't necessarily know how the community is using those right-of-ways as they're getting built out, being able to, without having the forum of the UVDC, how community members can be like, you know, we regularly use this with our kids, and now having this privately owned and cut off really doesn't fit the values of the urban villages and of the Highlands, and how we can basically trails was one example that I can give a hard one of saying that we've seen time and time come up of how a community is using a space, and as it's changed and developed, how we can basically integrate and resolve those things. Does that, I don't know if that makes sense to you of my point. But
Let me babble for a minute
Yeah.
because I'm not sure I'm entirely tracking. So I'm just kind of riffing on a couple of things I've heard you say. So first of all, things that are owned publicly by the city versus things that are owned privately, such as by the HOA, we are not proposing to change any of that. We're just proposing to reflect it using the CF zoning. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I can't say everywhere, but on many of the of the privately owned trails, we have an easement to the city to ensure that those are committed to and aren't going to be changed. So I think what we're talking about, and I heard kind of two things in what you were saying. One is there are these things that we have that we value, and we want to be able to access those things. And we agree, and that's the purpose of what we've written about trails. And we can talk about whether that's the right tool or the right way. Going forward, for properties that haven't been developed, I think that, for instance, there are several plats coming forward for shelter property and parts of Westridge that are either setting up lots for future development, single-family homes, or a site development permit for townhouses. And so those types of permits come to the UVDC or other public fora, and there will be an opportunity for the public, you know, there would be noticing, the site would be posted, and that would be an opportunity for undeveloped properties for people to come out and say, you know, I run through here, it's important that there's some kind of public connection, and for us to have a conversation about that.
Right, we've seen that, and so let's just hypothetically say that UVDC has another year on it. And so plats that are coming up and addressing, again, the specific need of reconciling these privately owned spaces with how the public is currently using them has been a great forum. Absent of that, is there a way for a land that isn't currently developed, but in the future, for there to be a way to basically integrate that concept into our existing trails and that kind of public right-of-way that I think has been really important in the Highlands? I didn't see any language about that because, again, it's a little vague and it's a little future, but it's a role that I can see disappearing that's been really, I think, important in the community.
So I want to, because you're using the term right-of-way, and I think it's kind of throwing me off, and I'm not sure we're saying the same thing, so I'm just trying to make sure I'm getting clarity. So partly I hear you talking about process, that the UVDC has been a good forum for those public conversations focused on how the urban villages build out, individual pieces of property build out. And then you're talking about right-of-way, and are you thinking specifically of streets or of
This is specifically
publicly
for trails.
access?
Publicly access. So for
Okay.
land that's been undeveloped, the community continues to use that. And so then when an owner rightfully comes in and wants to develop the property that they own, the community says, hey, we've actually been using this section to be able to connect to another trail or things like that. And being able, and in a traditional sense, a developer would be able to say, well, we don't really care. That's not what we want to do, and it's not really your purview to say so. But there's been a really good opportunity in developing the Highlands of being able to kind of have this blending. And we've seen developers want to work with the community, make everybody happy.
Right.
And it makes a big difference rather than saying, I don't like this coming in and feeling like you're not a part of the process, allowing the community to be able to say so. The trails reminded me of something where they're not actually labeled as a trail because they're not actually a trail. And it's just how the community is using that space.
Connectivity is what you're referring
Yeah.
to. Yeah.
So I think there are the thresholds of what goes publicly, goes into a public forum for some kind of land use permit, and what is administrative, still advertised, but administrative, those thresholds are not changing. And so it might be the UVDC, it might be DC, it might be the hearing examiner. I mean, there are a couple of different ways that things get processed in the city, depending on where it is. So I don't think the forum is disappearing, and I don't think the intention to have a place for people to comment and for the end result to be appropriately retained going forward. I don't think either of those are lost. And if you feel that the language is written is, I mean, I guess that's the question, is if you feel the language is written is not capturing that, or?
It's hard to capture spaces that aren't necessarily defined because they're not built out and they don't exist. They're not on a trail system, for instance.
Right, but we're relying, I mean, the urban design guidelines and goals are the tools that we've used in writing staff reports and working with the commission and/or the council, depending on what the permit is, to get those elements. And that's part of the reason we're retaining those two, is because we feel it's important to retain the tools that have been effective in building out the community with the character that it has.
I have a couple of quick questions. Sarah mentioned something about the ARC, well, a lot about the ARC, how important it is and the work that goes into it. So what happens to the ARC in Issaquah Highlands and Talus under this current proposal?
They're still there. We've specifically mentioned them in the text. I think that Patrick was bringing up a question of whether their purview was being significantly expanded. I don't think that was the intent, so we'll take a look at the language to make, I mean, I know Sarah and I spoke earlier today. She was comfortable with the language. I don't think we were intending to change something, so we'll go back and look at it and see if we're significantly changing it. I think that we want the ARC to have the opportunity to review the things that they want to review, and they sometimes say, I don't need to review that. So
They stay separate. Issaquah Highlands is one. Talus is another.
Each
Okay.
community. So, but I will just make one brief point. Talus has an ARC, Issaquah Highlands has an ARC. The TOD development agreement and the WashDOT TDR development agreement already rely on the Issaquah Highlands ARC, so that isn't a change to direct them to that organization.
Great, thank you. A couple other things. And forgive me if I didn't understand this, but I'm going back to Tia again. She mentioned mixed-use residential versus mixed-use non-residential. Under the plan here, 56, which is Shelter Holdings, piece of property, it's designated as mixed-use non-residential, and I wasn't clear.
I can explain. I think I know what she was speaking to.
Okay, thank you.
So their original and their entitlement that they possess right now is a certain amount of commercial, a certain amount of retail, and 3 residential units. And so what we proposed that Tia was identifying concern about was that instead of retaining the 3 residential units, that it would be converted to either retail or commercial at their choice.
And no residential, is that what you're saying?
Right.
Okay, so we're talking about 3 units at this time without any other changes.
Right.
Okay.
That's their existing entitlement.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Let's see, there's some stuff I can address with shelter when we get to the third, I believe the third agenda item. And then one question came up, how many remaining parcels are in Talus right now undeveloped remaining parcels?
So there's, in Talus, parcel 17B, which is owned by TriMet, and we will have a discussion about that. There is a little piece of property at the intersection of Shy Bear Way and Talus Drive that it looks kind of like a park, but that is really potentially a holding situation. The city was given that property because Intercorp was not able to develop it as non-residential use. It has 6,000 square feet of village center use associated with it. The city has proposed to retain that. That does not mean that we will or won't. There would be a public conversation about whether to move forward or to retain that as open space. The other piece is right here at the base of the reservoir. When the final plat goes through for 789, this little tail will be created, and as part of the first amendment to the Talus Development Agreement, that quarter acre was to go to the city and has 10 dwelling units associated with it.
So, and I would add, right now, parcel 9, and you might show them where parcel 9
Yes.
is. Parcel 9 was referred to earlier as the slide property. So it has a land use permit that's been approved, which is currently under red tag. Whether or not development can ever move forward on that property, there's a lot of things that still need to get figured out. And then the city has been unofficially contacted about possibility for adding units to parcel 1.
That's
Lucy, can
right.
you show where that is?
Yeah, so right here,
Can you define red tag before we move on?
Red tag means they can't move forward with development because the property moved.
it's a stop
I
work
think it's
order.
currently referred to by the community as Mount Plastic.
Yes, lovingly. So, yeah. So I would say technically it's undeveloped now, and it may remain that way forever. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. All right, any other conversation on this particular agenda item?
and then just, sorry, Talus is more complicated than it should be. 7 and 8 is still under a LUPA appeal. So who knows? That's Superior Court, and parcel 9 developer appealed the final plat. So it's sitting up there, kind of like it looks right there, and has been for like a year and a half, something like that.
Yeah.
Please.
And one of the things, because changes to the map are like a rezone, if by the time we're ready to adopt this, the LUPA appeal hasn't been finalized for 7 and 8, we may have a provisional platting based on the appealed final plat that will go into effect if it withstands the appeal, and if it doesn't, then it would have to go through a rezone process.
Okay, thanks for that. I'd like to move on to the next agenda item unless there's another comment here. We all good? Okay, terrific. So let's move on to agenda item B, Talus Parcel 17B. I think we're starting with TriMet, is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, and who's representing TriMet tonight for us? Welcome.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak and represent TriMet for the presentation. My name is Jeff Bates, and I'm with Collins Horman Architects. And let's see.
Just use the arrows up and down.
Or the return?
There we go. Okay.
And just if you would use the mouse to point.
Okay. Okay. And our firm has actually been, along with TriMet and others, actually been involved with Talus for a number of years. I mean, going back probably 15 years. And seen a lot of things come and go in terms of the market on the site, and just wanted to start with an overall orientation here. Basically, this is 17B in context with kind of the valley floor, the transit center here, and just some of the more commercial uses here, and the residential uses as the hillside slopes up. And next slide, zooming in a little bit more. Here is SR 900, Talus Drive, and then the parcel here. This is the Timber Creek project just to the west of our site with Falcon Drive here. I think since this slide has been taken, this has been built out here as well, but you can see a lot of the surrounding higher density multifamily zoning that's been built kind of in the whole Talus area. And next slide, this is the, just, kind of going back to a little bit of history here, just a review of the existing zoning. All the zoning for Talus is the urban village designation. And kind of go quickly here, but I did want to review, because, for me, even just going back to the office proposals is going back a few years, so it's handy just to kind of go back through that a little bit. This is a review of the current land use. You can see the Talus here, which is designated as the office use right now, and just some of the metrics associated with that. We're proposing, the reason we're here before you tonight is to talk about basically having the zoning of this site be more consistent with the multifamily zoning, the urban village multifamily, adjacent to some of the existing buildings. For example, the Timber Creek thing you saw in the aerial photograph to the east here. And just a refresher on the current proposal, site development permit approved in 2008. That project consists of 5 buildings, 516,000 feet of commercial, basically office, and parking stalls, almost 2,000 feet of parking stalls, and below building, surface parking, and above grade parking garages. One of the things to note is I mentioned, we've been looking at this project for years and years, and our office was actually involved in, this proposal with office uses. And even, from 2008, things got pretty slow for a few years. Things have come back. Even in that whole interim of time, the project has been actively marketed as an office use to a variety of users, and still stands dormant to this day. That's one of the reasons we're here tonight, to just talk about where the current status of the project is in terms of where the market is, and the fact that the office uses haven't really shown up at this point for this site for probably a variety of reasons: access, topography, just kind of where the market's gone. So this is the physical proposal back from 2008. We had 3 office buildings here, the one on the south, the taller one, then 2 here. We had below building parking here, a couple of levels of structured parking below the buildings, surface parking, and then a couple of freestanding garages here. You can see Falcon Drive here, and then this is the Timber Ridge project, obviously Talus Drive going up the hillside here. And I think this is just a good context photo to reacquaint us all with that development. This is a view basically looking west up the hill. Here's SR 900 and Talus Drive going up. Again, you can see the 3 office buildings here going from south to north. You can see some of the parking garage back behind, and then the Timber Creek project up further the hill. And this is kind of where we are now in terms of the development agreement. You can see the purple here is the surrounding village multifamily zoning. And this is shown on this chart as UV commercial. We refer to this elsewhere in our document, Lucy, as UV office, which I think is a correct determination in the Talus as opposed to the UV COM. We're going UVO versus UV COM.
Right, and I realized that was, in some places it's called UV office for Talus, and in some places it's UV com And we were
Right.
using office because that was consistent with the Talus development agreement, so that's one of the
Okay.
things we need to correct.
Okay. Just to kind of go over, Talus has been successful as a residential community. The office and retail uses really have been limited or non-existent based on the realities of market demand. We talked about kind of how the office building has been kind of languishing, frankly, in terms of market interest. We just looked at the 850,000 square feet of commercial contemplated by the development agreement. That includes office and retail. Approximately 10,000 of that has been built, and much of it's been vacant. Last time I checked up here, even the little pocket retail at the corner of Timber Creek, right on Talus, was still vacant. So again, that's one of the reasons that we're here to just talk about the uses and the owner's requested adjustment, TriMet's proposal for the property, based on the work that we've been looking at with Ken and his group over the past time to look at, okay, how can this really, within the context of the village multifamily zoning, make sense for this land use up on the hillside here. So right now, basically, this is what's you can see the UVO zoning with 516,000 square feet of commercial. What we're proposing is basically urban village multifamily and around 477 plus or minus residential units on the site right now. It's still conceptual. We're still early, but basically we're around 477 units. I'll show you what that looks like. So this is an aerial of the proposed massing. And later on, we have a couple of side-by-sides, so you can actually see them next to each other. But what we're proposing, quite different from the previous proposal, we're looking at multifamily here toward the south part of the site, and then basically townhouse developments here. We've got around 77 units of townhouses, and then the remainder of around 300 units here in these multifamily buildings, which are, again, the multifamily zoning, very similar to the scale we see with the Timber Creek project here. Basically, we oriented you to where Talus is, entry to the site, a new spine road proposed here, and then additional roadways to provide garage access to the townhouses. And a couple more views here. This shows entering the site, again, Talus intersection of SR 900, the taller multifamily building here, and then the townhouses to the north of the site. Again, Timber Creek development, you can see a little bit better here in terms of the lower scale development than the office proposal and the parking garages that we showed you a minute ago. And then wanted to have a little more detailed discussion of the proposed concept plan. As I mentioned, you saw the 77 townhouses, 400 multifamily homes. I think I misspoke a minute ago, so 300. 400's the target for overall residential of 577. No commercial in this proposal. Along with the multifamily, we have 500 garage stalls, and the townhomes basically have 2-car garages, so there'll be around 150 stalls plus or minus. Traffic, we've run some traffic studies on this. It's interesting to look at these numbers. We're looking right now at 287 trips, preliminary analysis on the parking. As far as the overall metrics and massing of the project, building height no greater than that allowed under the approved site development plan. Townhouses no greater than 40 feet, approximately 3-story type of buildings with that. And again, these metrics are high level and conceptual at this point, but at least they give you kind of an idea where we're going with this proposal. Then the next couple of slides, this one shows, again, just approved plan, 516,000 feet of office, or almost 2,000 parking garage stalls, and the total PMP that this had generated based on the previous studies done was about 633 trips versus where we're at now with 287. And again, the building height is all obviously consistent with the development agreement that was done back in 2008. And then a couple of side-by-sides. I think these are interesting to see. You can just look at the massing difference between, again, the 3 office buildings, the parking garages, Timber Creek. Most of the land area in this development was above parking, so we had landscape above structured parking, very dense scheme. This scheme, lower density in terms of allowing more landscaping over grade, more trees, more vegetation potential over the spine road and the access roads here. The larger building, we'd have some landscape over structure, similar to what we're doing here in this case, but the idea is to focus the zoning or the larger massing toward the south part of the project, and allow more view corridors and openings toward the Timber Creek to the east, looking over the valley. And then last comparison slide, we'll be standing right here looking up the hillside for both the schemes side by side. So again, you can see the office buildings here, structured parking in the background versus the proposed scheme with the taller multifamily building here and the townhouses to the north. And I want to be brief here and respect everybody's time. So that's the basic overview of the project, of the proposal, the metrics where we are to date. Just go ahead and open it up for questions and further discussion at this point. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Bates. Before we get into public discussion, I know I have a couple of questions, but I'd like to open it up to the other commissioners at this time. Joy, did you have a question?
I had one question. You had one slide that kind of showed all the different densities of housing. Is this considered medium density? The plan that you're putting forward,
This would be the equivalent density to the Timber Ridge project, the higher
was that
density.
considered high density?
Right.
High density, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah, I have a few questions. Mr. Bates, I got that right, Mr. Bates, right? Okay. So I'm just curious, I know you guys have been looking for a long time for potential tenants and people who might be interested in office use. I'm just curious, and this is me just not knowing this part of the business, but is it a question of whether or not somebody wants to come in and have something built to their specification versus somebody investing in an office building and trying to acquire businesses that might not need a ton of space or have very specific custom build needs? Does that make sense? So in other words, instead of a Costco needing a headquarters office, having an office building that could have 10 or 12 different, office tenants, can you help explain that to me?
Well, the way, and I'll let Ken weigh on this too, but this was done as a speculative office development. So if a single tenant took the entire 516,000 feet, a Costco or a corporate tenant, great. On the other hand, if it went to multi-tenants, a lot of smaller tenants, they were all office users, that would have been great too. I mean, that's the way the project was designed. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I'm wondering, in the latter scenario, is there someone that was willing to step up and build it and go after multiple tenants versus was the effort going towards somebody who really wanted more of a headquarters where they would be built to spec? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, probably speaking, the ideal it would have been the first scenario in terms of a, spec for a single headquarters.
But was there any effort made
Jeff,
over the...
Jeff,
yeah.
I think, let me try this, and Ken, feel free to jump in since it's your project. So what I believe we were told is that for them to get the financing to move forward with any part of that project, they would need a leasable tenant for at least half of the square footage.
Okay.
So the total was 500 and change for 3 buildings. For them to pull the trigger on any one building, they would need to fill at least half of a floor plate, basically.
That's helpful, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just
Yeah,
curious what effort was put forth toward that, because I know those are two really different scenarios, because if there's, I was just in the Bay Area, for example, which I know is a different market, but somebody built 3 massive buildings along 101, and they're just filling that up with smaller tenants that want to just take that space because it's there. If you build it, they will come, sort of thing.
Right.
Versus trying to sort of hamstring a company to get into a spec sort of scenario where they're on the hook for a massive building.
Right.
Does that make sense? Or
It
a
does.
set of buildings. So I was just curious
Yeah.
where that went.
Yeah, it does, and it's a good reminder of the minimum lease requirement, because I'd forgotten about that, so thanks.
Okay, and then, let's see. Building height, you had a slide there that said, can you go back, if you wouldn't mind, to the building height that said maximum allowable for current? So I'm wondering if the building height is related to the office use, or if it's related to a residential use, and if you're saying we want to build residential at the office height, or if we would be building at an approved residential height. Does that make sense?
See, you're talking about this slide here?
No, after that. Keep going, keep going. Another one.
It's not moving very fast because it's trying to be gracious.
I understand. There. Where it says building height, multifamily, no greater than that allowed under the approved site development plan. Is that approved for office or approved for residential?
It
And are
was-
those different?
It was it was basically, the height was a number of feet. In the,
For office, though, or commercial, would that be different if it
For
were
the-
residential?
for the commercial use. Well, the idea would be, it would be the same height envelope.
I understand that's what you're asking for, but I'm
Right.
curious, is there a difference on the residential side versus commercial from the city's point of view?
I think there's a slide here. I'm sorry, I keep taking over his presentation. Where is that? This one. So you can see office allowed an 85-foot height limit.
Yep.
And some of the high-density multifamily allowed 85.
Okay.
And some was
Medium
60, but
60 or
most
higher.
of them were 85 feet as
Okay.
well. So high density, if his scenario is high-density multifamily, office at 85 feet would have been.
Okay, so that fits in the realm. Okay, that's why
equivalent.
I was curious if there was any difference there. Okay, thank you for that. Have you thought about mixed use? Because I think of Talus, and I don't live there, so I can't speak for the residents there, but it seems to me, from what I've heard over the years, that Talus residents would like some sort of services there. And have you thought about that nice big piece of property that you have? Like, I'd be more inclined to be interested in a conversation about it. Not that I matter, but if I did matter, if someone were to say, look, we'd like to do mixed use there, let's put a bunch of multifamily residents there, but let's also put a convenience store, some dry cleaning services, or whatever it happens to be that the community needs and wants. Have you thought about that, and is that a viable option?
Well, we've looked at certain square footage of commercial use in the project. At the moment, we're not showing any. Maybe, Ken, you should speak to that a little bit more. I think, you know, I guess part of the issue is the old chicken and egg thing. You know, a lot of the retail that's been built in Talus, especially at Timber Ridge, the corner is set vacant. And
That's actually technically not retail.
Right.
That empty space is live-work units for Timber Ridge, so it's not entitled as retail. The retail that is entitled is actually being built as their first wine and coffee bar, so I think they're pretty excited about that.
Yeah, and having lived in the Highlands for as long as I have, you know, I can tell you that when you live in a community where you want to walk a lot, you want to gather with your neighbors, that sort of thing, if you have places to go, that's fewer trips in cars, that's you know, more of a community feel. I mean, it seems to me, this is the first time I'm seeing what you're proposing or what you're suggesting. It seems to me that you would want to say, let's embrace the community. If we're going to ask to move from office or commercial to residential, which is now just going to freak out the residents, saying there's just a lot more people going up and down that hill, that I would provide a bunch of services, retail, restaurants, something, so that the community members that live there can actually enjoy stuff on their property as opposed to having to go off property.
Right.
So I actually do live in Talus, and I think one of the things that I feel, and maybe it's heightened by the fact that of the slide issue, is that there's one road, and that's the only way to really get out. And if you're a pedestrian, which you're so close to the park and ride, but yet so far away because you have to typically walk up and then all the way down again, and then if you come home, all the way up and back down. If there were services that would alleviate some of that, and sometimes just going like a quick ride to the QFC is actually, depending on the time of day, it actually takes quite a long time. And I actually work at Costco. My commute's 2.2 miles. I can't really complain about that too much. But you'd be surprised at, depending on when I'm leaving, how long it can take me just to get, you know, a quarter of a mile. So if you're adding a spot there on a road that it services so many people without any other way of getting in and out, it's definitely going to be a concern.
So, yeah, and so thank you for speaking up, because far be it from me to speak for Talus residents. I'm not proposing to do that. But I would think if I lived there, and I know plenty of people who do, I would love to have some sort of service that I don't have to go. I mean, even if it's a few, even if it's, I mean, I think there's plenty of land that you've got. You're proposing 477 dwelling units. I think there's plenty of room to do some sort of mixed-use stuff that could be valuable for that community. And I would implore you to explore that deeply with those community members and see what's viable. And, I've been told year after year after year in the Highlands that the market's not going to bear this, the market's not going to bear that. And forgive me, but that's bullshit. The market's bearing everything that we bring to it. I saw Snoqualmie Ridge get built, the commercial part of that get built in a heartbeat relative to what we had in the Highlands that we were begging for from day one. And I would bet my career on the fact that if you were to go to the residents of Talus and say, hey, we want your support in building, taking out commercial and taking out office and putting in residential, but here's what we'll give you. We'll give you some services, some restaurants, some coffee shops, whatever it is. I think you'd be embraced by the community as opposed to deplored by them. That's my guess.
And I would just suggest, I'm not sure how feasible this is, so this is just a comment. But right now you've got this retaining wall, and it's actually a really beautiful retaining wall that someone spent a lot of time painting and making look very natural, and I think did a very good job. But that wall makes it almost non-passable by animals and people. And so you're, again, so close to the park and ride, but yet so far away because there is not a way for a person or a deer or, whomever to actually cross through that because it's just one giant wall that basically obstructs any kind of passage. So I don't know if there would be a way to allow some passage through there, but people could walk down and to the park and ride and have a lot more options as far as alternative transportation versus being forced essentially to drive because there's no busing system up there. I'm not suggesting that we put a busing system up there, but you basically have no options other than Uber or commuting with your neighbors or something.
That's terrific insight, and I think that should be looked at. Yeah. Anybody else like to say?
Yeah,
Joy?
I just want to echo Jeff's comment about community involvement. When we are looking at these proposed changes, we really rely a lot on the information that the city is giving us and the feedback we're getting from the community. So when there's a lot of conflict, it makes it a lot harder for us to come in and say, yeah, this looks like a really easy change. Whereas when having some sort of, regardless of what it is that the community is looking for, having some sort of bridge makes it a lot easier for us to be able to say, this is in the best interest of the community and we're more than happy to do that change. It makes everything go a lot smoother. So I can't speak to, and I don't know what kind of outreach you guys have done of trying to amend. Obviously, you guys have entitlements and a plan that isn't working and you want to make that work. And I think the community also has this desire to see this resolved. And so just being able to have, regardless of what it is, I'm not saying that you haven't done it already, but us being able to see we've taken this feedback and been able to integrate that makes a huge difference when we're looking at this.
Anyone else? Okay, would you like to respond to any of that before we go to public comment?
Well, I can understand trying to get some mix of residential and the right kind of retail uses, and I think that's the key in working in the community and saying what are those right kind of retail uses. And Ken, if you have anything to add on that in terms of.
We're happy to explore that.
Ken, you need to be at the microphone.
Excuse me. I'm Ken Bellamy. I represent Talus Corporate Center, which is the owner of the property. My response was just on exploring the commercial uses, the retail uses, and certainly we'd be willing to sit down and explore what opportunities there are there.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I'm not saying that what you're proposing is right or wrong or good or bad. I'm just saying that I think there's an opportunity here if you want to get support from the community as opposed to what I know is going to be, why are we just building a bunch more homes in my neighborhood? And be able to create some really good goodwill and actual services and retail. I would explore all of your opportunities there, and I think it could be a win for everybody if you do it right. Okay, so at this time then, thank you very much. I would like to open up the public comment section for this agenda item, Talus Parcel 17B. I have the sign-in sheet right here, but I don't have anybody for section 2. Is there anybody who would like to speak? Okay, Chris, I'm going to go ahead and, let's see here. If you wouldn't mind, when you're done speaking, just sign on this sheet so we have your contact.
Sort of like after the fact.
Thank you. I'll look at that. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Chris Ray. I live at 2498 Northwest Stony Creek Drive in Talus. I've been a resident of Talus for about 10 years now. This proposal absolutely makes no sense for Talus. It makes no sense for the city of Issaquah, and quite frankly, it makes no sense for the region. There are two problems that we as a region and as a community are facing right now. One is overdevelopment, and the second is traffic, and this exacerbates both of those problems. There are very few tools that the city has to control development and manage traffic, and zoning changes are one of them. If you are considering making a zoning change, you have to be very thoughtful, and you have to consider the obvious consequences of this action. This is not a small development. This is a 25% increase in the number of dwelling units in Talus. So they're making it sound like this is no big deal. This is a 25% increase in the size of Talus with no infrastructure and no roads and everyone coming through already congested roadways. There are better ways to do this. Earlier we talked about the character of Talus. This fundamentally changes the character of Talus. This fundamentally changes the neighborhood into a primarily rental, which will lower property values, which is not what we signed up for when we moved into Talus. This is a really bad idea. This is in conflict with the city's direction and the Central Issaquah plan, and there are far, far better uses of this land than putting in high-density residential at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ray. Anybody else like to speak on this topic? Yes, sir.
Jeff Wilfong again, the Talus Board President. I'll be brief because Chris made a lot of the points. We've had a lot of conversations. Ken and I have had an opportunity to sit down and talk about what he's planning for the property a couple times. I think we had a board meeting. They came in and presented at a board meeting, and then Karen and I were able to go sit down and talk about what their thoughts are here. As a board, we're in opposition. And the primary reason is, you heard a lot of that from Chris, when you look at just the sheer density, the number of rentals. But one of the key things is the magic of the office was that you had a reverse traffic pattern. What this does is, in the comments around the comparison to Timber Ridge, obviously you know what Timber Ridge is. I mean, Timber Ridge is not a community that's traveling back and forth to work every day. So, but this would be. So 477 units coupled with 77 townhomes, I think would just add probably more than the initial proposal of 287 traffic count to 900. For those of you that deal with 900, we deal with it every day. You know, luckily for me, I run an odd schedule, so I don't have to get into the thick of it. But when I do, it's just impassable. And I just can't fathom adding, 500 more units in Talus that would be trying to navigate that same roadway, in and out. So Ken and I have had a lot of conversation. He's been very willing to sit down and talk about some potential options beyond this. But we as a board are pretty solid that this is not something that we could support. And I would have a very hard time going to the annual meeting that's coming up and saying that we are going to have something like this happen in Talus. Lucy made the comment earlier about making sure we kept the community's character forward. And there's not high density in Talus. There's high density assisted living in Talus, but there's not high density residential with commuter traffic in Talus. So that's where the board is. That's where I am as a resident and as well as a board member. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Wilfong. Anybody else like to speak? Porterfield.
Karen Porterfield, Talus resident, HOA board member, and here tonight to talk about this. A couple things. I'd like to start out with kind of repeating what Keith said. We're a desirable community. That means we have choices, and that's a great place to be. So as our board chair said, we don't have that much high-density housing. When you look at it, Timber Ridge, wonderful group, they're not all out there driving every day. Thank goodness for that. So we may have the density, but we don't have that hit of traffic. Two, I want you to also think about the access to Talus. Any of us who have tried to fight our way down 900 during work time, wow. We just put 1,000 more cars in that mix because you're going to assume 2 cars per residence. Pretty much 95% of those people will be working. That's a lot of places, a lot of cars to put on the road. Next one, and I really want to come back to this community spent such hard work and did good planning to create the Central Issaquah Plan, which really defined our high-density housing on the valley floor, close by things like the transit park, where you could walk and catch the bus. You could use alternative means of traffic. As was talked about earlier, we are a little marooned up there. Anybody who's walked up that hill, I've tried. It's hard work. People, and we have no other way off, so we will be driving. We want to put that high-density housing where it encourages alternative means of traffic. It is a significant hit on our property value. The higher your percentage of rental housing, the more it tips in your costs. And I just want you to close your eyes for a minute and think about the Atlas. So that has approximately 346 units in that development, right across from Safeway. All right, take that and increase it to 477. So as was talked about earlier, we have approximately 2,000 housing units. That would increase us by 25% in a very small space. And I do want to point out, the board and all of us have met with these owners on several occasions. We have been very open. We have not said we don't want housing. What we've said is no to high-density housing. We've asked for mixed use. We've asked for that retail. We know our homeowners want it. They tell us when they come to our board meetings, when they come to the annual meetings. People who drive up 900 would probably love to stop there to pick up something for dinner, to do their dry cleaning. There are so many opportunities. And it's unfortunate that in a way, what they've chosen to show you is very kind of like almost scary. Look, if you don't agree to what we want, this is what we're going to give you. And that's not okay because there's lots of choices in between. So I just want you to think about this. And somebody made the point earlier, the single most powerful control that the city has in you and the city council is how you choose to zone. And how you choose to zone impacts everything from fire to traffic. So we do not support this. We have been very clear with them. We have asked for mixed use. We have said we love townhomes. We have asked for retail. And we keep getting the same presentation back. So I appreciate that they're coming and talking to us, but I don't think they're listening to us. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Porterfield. Anybody else like to speak? Mr. Eastman?
Ken Eastman again. So I understand the property rights argument, but the applicant is asking for a change that will benefit them. It seems like the residents should expect a change that also benefits the residents. There's a lot of net liability in this, as was explained by the previous speakers. I would just encourage the property owner to go back and get creative about how to develop this property in a way that the residents of Talus see as a net benefit, because right now there aren't going to be too many people in Talus that are going to think that this is a good idea. And as was previously mentioned, with all the problems that we've had with development in Talus, there certainly is a heightened sense of awareness on what's happening to our community. So I would just suggest that these plans get reworked, and as the commission has suggested, come up with a way that this is a net benefit to the community, not a liability. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Eastman. Anybody else like to speak at this time? Asking again. And last call. Okay, so seeing nobody else like to speak at this time for public comment on agenda item 2, we will close the public comment section. Thank you very much. Let's go ahead and have a discussion on this. I know I have a couple of questions that have come out of this, but I'd like to open the floor.
Do we want to allow the applicant to speak to any of the public
We
comments?
could, certainly, but I actually, if you don't mind,
No, I
I think
don't.
we'll bring some stuff up, and then we can certainly ask the applicant back to address any and all of our questions, as well as some of the public comment, but yes.
So I have a question that probably could be addressed by, I'm not sure the gentleman's name, but the concept of reverse traffic, just maybe elaborate on that.
Mr. Wilfong, yeah.
And then when elaborating on that, kind of the income that we would expect for the type of people that might be working in those communities, not necessarily the property, the residential area, but if there was a commercial area, or is that off the table, this new plan?
I don't know, but I'm not sure that that's relevant
So we can talk
necessarily.
about the reverse commute concept, so you guys can understand that. As far as sale price for residences, that's not something we can legislate. So I would rather keep that one off the table, although we can speculate maybe later.
Okay.
So the concept of reverse commute is, if you think about it, people leave their houses and go a certain direction to commute to work in the AM peak. And in the PM peak, and peak hours, so AM is like 7 to 9 and PM is 4 to 6. So during those times, if you're a certain land use, the general kind of stream heads a certain direction, and in the evening it goes the other direction. So for example, from Talus, the AM peak, most of Talus is coming off the hill and driving either north or south on SR 900 to get to their place of employment, or to the transit center if they take transit. And in the PM, it's the opposite direction. So by having this be office, there's two pieces to that. One is there's actually an internalization credit that was given to Talus. The idea that some of the people that live in Talus would actually choose to work at the office that was built in Talus. So there was a credit for traffic trips related to just the mix of uses happening, which would potentially not happen if this converts to residential. The second piece is, if those are built as residential and not office, those trips coming from that land use would get in the stream with the rest of the trips from Talus, and would actually be additive to the roadway and bog down the kind of the delays that are there now. So it's an additive problem because it's joining with similar land uses, as opposed to being an opposite land use, which would flow the other direction in the morning and the opposite direction in the evening.
Okay, so that makes sense. So if it were more commercial oriented, then you would get the reverse traffic, but if it remained more another option for residential, then it just would add to the current existing traffic flow.
Right, they would be in the same line that you all are in at 4 o'clock trying to get home.
And as a follow-up to that, I'm curious where that number 287, I think it was 287, is that the number? Where did that number come from? Because that seems awful low to me when you're talking about 477 units.
So that's the first time we saw that number, so we're not ready to vet that number. I think part of this is, and I was thinking about that because we're down to logistics. So there's a SEPA piece that needs to go with ending the development agreement, but it's typically what's called a non-project SEPA decision. So basically, there would be another SEPA that would be required for their land use if ultimately you guys agreed to a change of zone. At that point, right now, what I can tell you is SR 900 and Talus Drive is one of the intersections that the council agreed to leave at a failing standpoint because it would take too much to fix it, and we don't control the traffic that's going to Renton. And so right now, it's level of service F in our concurrency scheme. And so adding trips to that is really complicated. They would have to figure out how to mitigate it so that those trips, however many, whether it's 287 or 694, that wouldn't add to the delays at that intersection.
Right. So 2 questions. One is specifically related to traffic. Do you guys know right now where Talus is in terms of level of service in the community? Is there capacity right now for additional trips beyond what's already been approved?
That was what he was just explaining. That
that intersection's failing. I'm saying like even within the community.
You mean once you get off of SR 900?
Yeah.
So once you get off of SR 900, the level of service within Talus is all at level of C or above, yes.
Okay. All right. And then I have 2 more questions related to that. What is the so I guess I'm not clear on what the entire process is. What's the question here? Are they asking for a zoning change? And if that's the case, what's the process to make that? Is that your decision? Is that our decision? Is that the council's decision? What happens?
It's the council's decision. So the administration has made a recommendation. That's what you see in this packet. The applicant is asking for something different. UVDC, the official recommendation would come from PPC because that's where the hearing would be held, but that's why we're holding these jointly, because a lot of the institutional memory and experience comes from UVDC, but we feel that both commissions contribute to having a well-rounded conversation. But then in the end, the council has to approve it because it's a zoning change.
Okay.
So, and typically when you rezone a single piece of property, it's considered quasi-judicial, right? Because you are making a decision about one person's piece of property. But the city attorney, because we're dealing with basically 2 very big area rezones, the city attorney has considered this a legislative action as an area rezone. And so even though you have 2 particular property owners that are asking for something unique, it's all being classified under an area rezone, which then allows us to have these conversations. Otherwise, they would need to follow quasi-judicial proceedings.
Okay, thank you. And then I'll ask one other question related in the event that a zoning change does happen and miraculously this does go forward. Have any discussions around schools been had in terms of where would these kids go? Where would they be? Where would the capacity be for any families and schools related to these residential units? Has that even come up at this point?
We haven't talked to this. I mean, we talk to the school district regularly. They get, they're kept in touch. They use our active projects map regularly to see what's happening.
Right.
So we would certainly keep them looped in. But we're not part of the determination of which children go to which schools.
Right, I understand that. I would think, though, that if a zoning change occurred, that conversation would have to happen, or should happen, maybe not technically have to happen, but should happen before any decision was made so that we weren't causing additional problems for the school district or for those families, and we actually had a plan, or at least a path to a plan. So I just don't, that's just something I wanted to bring up. After having met with Lisa Callan a few days ago on some other things, that stuff's top of mind for me, so.
So I'm seeing the proposal from the applicant. I'm not seeing anything from the city saying, yes, we believe the infrastructure can support this. Does the city have a position right now on this?
Our position was the land uses that were in the packet, which is the existing entitlement.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes,
Yeah,
Tara.
just for my benefit again. The quasi-judicial portion, can you explain that again? Does that mean that we have more authority over this decision, or
No, it means that.
recommendation to the council?
So, no, it means, so because this is not being considered quasi-judicial.
Not being considered.
It's not. It's being considered legislative.
As he picks up the gavel.
Okay, I thought I heard it the other way around.
No, it's legislative. So it gives us more flexibility to have conversations and to allow less formal testimony and potentially allowing people to come up and not having to worry about whether rebuttal needs to happen, or it gives us more flexibility to have these conversations, which at the end of the day, I think is pretty good.
And you know, just because we're not technically, we're rezoning all the properties in these urban villages, which is why this is legislative, because any property owner could show up, not just these two. We are aware of these two, but any property owner could show up and say, I want something different or more or whatever. It's just that we were aware of these two. The commissioners last time asked for these to be segregated conversations so that it was easier to focus on each of the pieces.
But right, and that's why we did, public notice for everybody. I mean, if Lindsay wanted to say, I want to rezone my property to multifamily, let's have that conversation. She gets her 2 minutes of sunshine as well.
So the intent of these meetings are to just create an open dialogue, open forum, get feedback, maybe kind of like a focus group, if you will, on this.
I think so. I mean, as I think we tried to say earlier, a lot of what's being proposed is what staff believe, based on our interaction with the community, what they wanted to see at the end of the day. But based on the conversation that happens here and the testimony you're hearing from the public, you guys, that may land in a different place. So this is getting the best recommendation we can to give to the council so that it makes their job a little easier, hopefully.
I wanted to, Keith, what I was going to say is that ultimately what we want to do is give the best recommendation to council of after since we've seen it, they want us to have eyes on this. So from the perspective of the big difference of UVDC being quasi-judicial, whereas PPC is we make recommendations to the council, so nothing that we do is set in stone. We look at it and we change possibly what the city may or may not want, and it's ultimately up to the council, but our goal is to hear as many sides and details as possible so that we can make the best recommendation to council based, so that they can look and kind of, we've done a little bit of the homework for them in a sense when they're making that decision.
And I just would add, UVDC, because they do development agreements, has been in the same boat. So it's more like a development agreement discussion and approval than it is like a site development permit or a plat.
Okay. All right. Anybody else like to add anything? Lindsay, are we keeping you up? Okay. So I guess if you guys don't mind, I'd like to ask if the applicant would like to respond before we move on to the next topic, or if you guys are good. Mr. Bellamy, Mr. Bates? I think we're good. Okay. Thanks very much. All right, then. I'd like to move on then to agenda item number 3, or C, in this case, Issaquah Highlands, presented by Shelter. Who's going to speak tonight? Is it Gary? You? Okay, thanks.
So I was just going to tell you, you just do up and down, and then if you can use the mouse if you want to point to anything. You're welcome.
My name is, I think the mic's on. Good. Yep.
That one doesn't go off.
Oh, light's on.
Just have to get close.
I'll get close. Good evening. My name is Gary Young with Shelter Holdings, 11624 Southeast 5th, Suite 210, Bellevue, Washington. Chairman Walker and commission members, we very much appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. We have an outline we want to present, and Tia's here and Eric's here, and we'll walk through that very briefly. I would just like to touch on A couple of things just briefly. Shelter Holdings, it's a family business. We've been building, my partner and I, in the Issaquah community for over 25 years. We're very invested in this community in terms of property we own, also in the nonprofit sector and different organizations within this community that we actively support. We see ourselves as maybe a different developer than many developers that have worked in the city because we're so invested in the community. My partner's 3 daughters were educated and graduated from Issaquah High School, and so that's progress as well. So just to touch on our property, we often refer to that as the High Street Collection, and our entitlement through the development agreement process is 1,626,337 square feet of commercial, 225,250 square feet of retail, and 3 residential units that we love. I would like to also just clarify the development capacity that was granted in exchange for the infrastructure improvements that were made by the property owner. And it's very important that the new code continues to recognize these major infrastructure investments. So I'd now like to bring Tia to come and take the next step in giving our presentation tonight. Thank you.
Okay, so before I get into our request, I did want to respond to one question, Jeff, that you had asked about what happens if it's delayed past December enacting new zoning. And the development agreement is actually pretty clear that it stays in place until the new zoning is enacted. So if it were a situation where the city was refusing to act, then yeah, Port Blakely would probably be upset and there would be other issues. But I don't think that it sets any specific time frame. So if the council doesn't meet that end of the year goal, there's nothing in the development agreement that would be an issue. The other thing I wanted to clarify before we get into our request is just to make sure that everyone keeps track of the approach that's been proposed has 2 elements. It has the zoning, and then it has an overlay that's property specific. And I think that's a different concept than we're used to in most cases. And it's important to keep that in the back of your mind as you're considering different things, because the zoning sort of sets the baseline of possibilities of what could go there. And then the way they've proposed it is the overlay restricts what actually could go there. So that's where it takes from the development agreement, your entitlement. So like you saw on the previous slide, our entitlement, and would apply it to the specific property. So what we're asking for is that our zoning designation matches our entitlement. So that would be the UV mixed-use residential. And then that the overlay, our request is that it would also allow for conversion of a portion of the commercial and or retail to residential, so that mixed-use projects that really embody the live, work, play mantra could be realized. It's important to us that you not take away our residential units. 3 may not seem like a big deal in the scheme of things, but it is important, and it's important to us. The conversion of some of the commercial to vertical mixed-use residential, so that's residential over either commercial or retail or services or restaurants, is really important to encourage the development of office or other commercial uses. It also responds to some of the things that the residents of Issaquah Highlands want. And we've done some extensive research that and outreach that Eric will give you more details on when he comes up. But that office component really needs residential to be developed along with it. Any new office user, one of the things that they consider when they're looking at moving or putting an office space in, particularly if you're not in a downtown Bellevue or Seattle core, where do our employees live? Where can they afford to live? Where are they coming from? And in Issaquah, there's a shortage of housing options. I know that may seem like a hard thing to to acknowledge, but it is true. It's true of the whole Puget Sound region, but it's especially true in Issaquah Highlands when you look at housing types. So we heard from people who maybe live in a house that they raise their kids in, their kids aren't there anymore. They would love to have some other type of housing to move into that doesn't have a yard or that kind of thing. It just doesn't exist. If they want to move into a condo, they're probably moving to Bellevue or Kirkland, and that isn't the same. It's not staying in the community. Another interesting fact, there hasn't been any new Class A office space developed in Issaquah since 2001. And it's not for lack of effort by the property owners. You heard from these guys at Talus. They've been working hard on trying to make it happen there, and it hasn't. You also have a huge capacity for additional office space, both in central Issaquah, in the Costco development agreement, in the Rowley development agreement. So if and when there's users that want to come to Issaquah, there are lots of places that it could go. Part of it is economics. You've got to have rents that justify new construction. But the other factor is market competition. So when you're looking at going outside the urban cores of Seattle and Bellevue, there's lots of places between there and here. So you need to be able to create an atmosphere that draws those users and say, to make them say, yeah, Issaquah Highlands is where we want to have an office. It makes sense. And so creating that vibrant, walkable, mixed-use community with lots of amenities and restaurants and retail options is an important part of it. And there's some of that there, but there needs to be more that can be developed in conjunction from it. So we're not here advocating for the plan that you may have seen when we did our outreach before, which was primarily mixed-use residential only. We want to develop a plan that has all the elements. It has the commercial, it has the retail, and it has some of the mixed-use residential in a vertical mixed-use format. The 24-hour presence that residential element brings supports a different type of retail and services. And from the feedback that we got from the community, that's the type of thing they want. They want the non-chain restaurants. They want the services that need to be supported by having that presence there around the clock. The community also expressed desire for underground parking, which is great. That's what we would like to do, but that's really expensive, and you need some residential to offset the cost of the underground parking. Another important thing to consider is allowing residential uses in Issaquah Highlands allows for the opportunity to respond to different types of needs for different types of housing. So senior housing is one we've heard a lot of interest in. Workforce housing is another one that's super important, and then the move down product, like I mentioned before. There's on the workforce housing topic. We all know there's a great need for housing for our teachers and first responders and all the people that we really need in our community. But it goes much deeper than that and cuts across all industries. We at Shelter have been trying to work on creative ways to start to help address some of this, and we actually started a pilot program with Issaquah Schools Foundation to try to help get teachers and other district employees into apartments at reduced costs. Let's see. Oh, it's also important to point out that on the north end of our site, these are some drawings of what a vibrant mixed-use community that incorporates residential and office and commercial retail might look like. These, you may have seen some of these before. But the proximity to the park and ride is important. So there's only a certain number of places that you can do transit-oriented development, and this is one of them. And it would really be a missed opportunity if we did not take advantage of the proximity to the park and ride, because there is opportunity to use that as alternative means of transportation. So with that, I want to turn it over to Eric, and he'll give you a little bit of background on the work that we've done to date.
Thank you, Eric Evans, Shelter Holdings. It's good to see you again. I'm going to go to another slide. if I could. So over the past few years, we've engaged a lot of professionals to help us understand what's going on in the market, understand the constraints, the opportunities on the property. We've learned a lot. We've heard from the community about the type of retail users, of commercial users they'd like. We've learned a lot about the innovative partnership zone for medical research, sports medicine, and the types of businesses. We've engaged Kinzer Group, which is a leading real estate broker. They've landed a lot of these kind of tenants throughout the area to help us talk to these people, draw them in. The Broderick Group is another current broker who is actively working to draw some of the offices of all kinds, small users, large users, whatever we can bring together. They do a lot of work on the east side. They're very strong. They do a lot of work with Microsoft and a variety of employers. In addition, these firms have done a lot of outreach to some of the medical users that could support and complement Swedish Hospital, Proliance, and we've also worked with Real Retail. They're the leasing agent for Grand Ridge Plaza, and got a good sense of how we might complement what's up there at Grand Ridge and bring the type of users that the community wants. One thing I think we've come away with is we've talked to these businesses and we've talked to, as Tia mentioned, some of the retail that the community really wants. That 24-hour presence is really important. And not only the people that we're talking about who would locate their office here, who are looking for housing, when we talk to Swedish, when we talk to Grand Ridge, they struggle with places for their employees. So the opportunity to try to couple some housing with these uses that we want to do is a really strong economic development tool that we think you shouldn't miss and should incorporate into the community, and the reason why the zoning request has been made. There is a component associated with that when we cobble housing together in a vertically integrated mixed use that has a way of capturing some of the trips. And I think that's a nice opportunity. It was intended and contemplated in these communities, and having a really vertically integrated mixed-use community can do that. So I think that's something we all want to try to accomplish. It's part of the vision and values, so I would hate to lose that as part of this zoning process. I'm gonna, bear with me. So we've done, I think it's 3 open houses with the community. We asked for their ideas, what they wanted to see, to come up with a new vision. We did a series of focus groups after that, after coming together with a plan to make sure, did we hear what they wanted right? We did focus groups on transportation. We did focus groups on public services. We did focus groups with Michael on the type of parks that the community wanted and that would cobble together to these retail. And out of these outreach meetings, we learned a lot and went back out to the businesses and started to say, hey, they want you here. What do we need to do? And we continue to work that way. You'll bear with me here while I go to the next slide. Oops, sorry. So some of the, we tried to put images together. I think Michael touched on some of the characteristics that the people wanted to feel. They wanted the large setbacks, the places to gather at night to watch the sun go down and sip wine. And I would have never thought of an amphitheater, and that was something they would like. And I think as you start to cobble these uses together and think about zoning, these are the kind of things that we would want to work together with you on. I think if you had a chance to look at the letter, we're also coming to the table with an additional option that isn't here, and we think it has a lot of merit. And I think we'd be willing to just extend the development agreement. From our perspective, there's no rush here. The uses that you want to see accomplished, the retail, the commercial, there's no reason to end the development agreement from our perspective. Give us some time. Let's work together and try to keep with the vision. We like working with the UVDC. We like working with the staff. This would be a nice opportunity to say, though, let's focus for a next period of time and just extend the development agreement. We think that has merit. I can't say, we develop up and down. up throughout the Puget Sound and Portland, mixed-use communities, mixed-income communities all over. This development agreement works. It's not broken. I just think we all need to give ourselves a little bit more time. So that's an option we'd ask that you think about. I'd also say that these are complex things. They warrant a lot of time. I've done a number of development agreements in different cities, and they warrant the time to think how things fit together, not just one zone. There's been a lot of changes. Proliance, Swedish, Regency, these all have different characteristics. And understanding the edges and how things all fit together is the type of thing we do in a development agreement. And we'd entertain doing a new development agreement with you, spending the time thinking it through and cobbling all these uses together in a way that feels good, not just trying to quickly establish zoning because the development agreement is ending. The code says that you can, if you're zoned, you can do a development agreement if you're over a certain acreage, and it's 15 acres. Our site's 22 acres. So the development agreement kind of feels like there's a real opportunity here to come up with a nice public benefit for everybody that has some of the things that Michael was talking about, that responds to the people who are saying, I want to be able to walk from my house to the hospital when I get older, and I want all these types of mixes of uses. So that might be something you might want to think about in this process. Gary's better at closing than I am, so I'm going to let Gary close if that's okay. Oh, sorry.
You're really good at that one.
I missed one.
Some more feedback from public outreach, I think, was an important point. Maybe you just want to touch on that for a second.
I'm having a hard time.
Okay, it's too hard to see. I apologize.
Go ahead.
We want to be respectful of time. It's getting late. I think everyone can see the diagram, and just the point being that just there's an interrelationship of all these uses, and mixed use is really critical, and Jeff spoke about that earlier in terms of the other community. What slide do we have now? End development agreement, no change, and then the next one. So just to summarize, we're very vested in this community. All of you here are volunteers. You're working hard, and you care about the community, and we just want you to also hear from us to know that we also care about the community. And our end goal is to be able to own this property for a long time and to be enjoying this particular community together with the residents of the community. We've had quite a few public meetings. We have great relationships with people in the community, and we have revisited the residential component. We know that the numbers that came out earlier were very distressful, and so now we're looking at a totally different perspective, and our perspective really is focused on the work component and the retail component. But we do believe that there will be a need at some point in time for some form of residential that helps to complement for all the reasons, all the pressures we have in our society. So the options that we've just put forward here, that one, extended development agreement, no change option, allows us to continue to work. Keeps everything simple, and as a property owner, we're willing to partner with the city to work through that and work with the community and the UVDC or the combined commission. The new zoning designation, if this is where you decide that you do want to go, this designation we'd ask would just be a UV-MUR and wouldn't have that a line of no residential. We'd like to not delete that part. So this designation matches our existing entitlement. That's important. Overlay should also allow for conversion of some commercial to residential as needed, but we'd have to demonstrate that and go through approval process. Allows for opportunities for workforce housing, senior housing, group homes. There's so many elements of our society that have need, and we're very capable at addressing those needs. We're focused on quality and a good spirit of community, and we'd like to have that chance. And finally, just the support would encourage the commercial and retail development. So we thank you very much for your time. We appreciate all the work that staff has for years. I mean, Keith and Lucy, Issaquah Highlands is an amazing community, and we're very, very, we feel blessed to be a part of this community, and we're very committed to be successful in this community, and that means that the residents will be feeling good about it, and we will, and everyone driving by will go, wow, that turned out really great. So that is our goal, And we want to thank staff, we want to thank all of you tonight, and answer any questions.
Thank you, Gary, Tia, and Eric. Appreciate that. Before we move on, I want to ask if anybody's interested in speaking publicly, if we can go ahead and get that sign-in sheet ready to go so that I don't ask for it at, we'll get there in a moment, but I just want to get that started. Thank you very much. I know I have a ton of questions and thoughts, but again, I'm going to open it up first to the rest of the commission. Joy?
My question is for staff. Lucy, how and why can a previous entitlement of residential be taken away? Right now, it seems to be a question of right now, these 3 residential units are now being proposed that they would no longer hold that entitlement anymore. How and why can that happen? What is the position of city staff as to why is that happening?
Well, at the end of the development agreement, as the development agreement is being closed out, our understanding is that we could change everything. That isn't our proposal at this time.
So I think the reason why we weren't suggesting what the applicant has asked for is because, in our opinion, if 3 million square feet of commercial and retail use and 3 residential units, they're dividing their property into 5 parcels right now through a platting process. They don't even have a residential unit to put on each parcel. So I think, from my perspective, I think we're all going to be gone at some point. I don't plan to live forever. At some point, explaining why that's mixed-use residential, that sends a very different message than mixed-use non-residential, which is really what they own. Those 3 units, I think staff's willing to have a conversation with them about, we can make them non-conforming, we can make them, there's things that we can do besides putting residential on that zoning designation for that property. It seems to me that sends the wrong message.
In other words, if I could, can I follow up on that? That the non-residential more closely aligns with what they have today versus the residential use. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And staff is willing to work with them and be able to allow them to still have that entitlement without necessarily being in their zoning.
I'm sure we can figure out.
You're open to a
I'm sure
dialogue
between
on it.
us and their attorney in the back row, we can figure out a way to preserve those 3 units.
There are other options that we can have them be non-conforming and not have the entitlement still stay in place without including it in the code. There are other options on the table.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good question. You have a question?
So we can just put an asterisk on their mixed use non-residential that says, and 3 residential units. I mean, there's ways to do that.
Victoria, did you have something?
Yeah, I have a couple of comments and a couple of questions. So the comments are, in previous PPC meetings, we've had a number of discussions about the mixed use and the vertical mixed use and the desirability of that. It came up earlier in the Talus discussion. So that would be one of the zoning options described by the applicant. But it is something that has come up a number of times for other communities in Issaquah, as something that people desire. And also the idea of having different housing, smaller housing units, different types of housing units for different people, and that's also come up a number of times, as has the underground parking. So there were a number of things that we've discussed previously as being desirable that came up that might be facilitated by including residential. And then I just had a question about with the non-conforming option. I had 2 questions. One is about the non-conforming option. What is that? What are the consequences of that for them, or is that specific to each case?
I don't think there's, so I don't know that we would call it non-conforming because it doesn't exist. It would be probably, and again, I'm kind of thinking on the fly, this would be something we'd work out with them, like asterisking the map to say there's 3 residential units, even though it's a non-residential zone. I think we could do it that way, and I don't know that there would be any detriment to them. They could get permits to build those three units.
And then my other question was, I think, pretty simple, but about the extending the agreement. So earlier, I thought that there was a set date, but the agreement was ending, but then it sounds like it could be extended. So is this a different agreement than the one that had the set date?
So build-out period ends in September. The development agreement can go on indefinitely unless one party or the other, the master builder, master developer, or the city requests to terminate. Port Blakely is asked to terminate.
So they're going to be not party to this anymore. So it's a two-party agreement where there's only one party. So they have no qualms about that continuing forever. I think it proves a logistical issue for the city. And so that's why the administration is very clear that we're recommending that both of these development agreements end this year. So, but from a property owner's perspective, they like what they've got. So there's a reason why they would like it to continue, right? Because nothing changes. And those 20-year-old standards, stormwater, everything else, they just continue. Critical areas, all that stuff that's 20 years old for Issaquah Highlands would just continue indefinitely. And I think there's reasons why we think that's not prudent for the city to agree to.
So what about the idea in that of creating a new development agreement?
So any property owner, and it doesn't have to be 15 acres, any property owner can ask the city council for a development agreement. We just approved one for Gilman Lofts on Gilman, a new office project that is going through permitting right now. So for Urban Village, it has to be 15 acres. But the city does do development agreements for non-urban village properties, and there is no minimum acreage. So they can ask, and it's up to the city council on whether or not they would agree to that. And then there's a process that is followed to actually develop that draft agreement and take it through the city council.
I mean, it's a time-consuming process, even for Gilman Lofts, which was a very small site and a fixed term, almost more of a traffic partnering agreement. Takes a lot of staff time, and so it is a commitment that the council, because they ultimately have to approve it, they need to agree to instigate this process.
Did you have something?
And again, apologize about being a new person, but I think 3 units, I think 3 houses. I mean, what is 3 units as far as residential?
3 houses.
That's it?
Yep.
Yeah.
3 single-family homes?
Or a triplex.
Okay.
So if I could jump in here. So, I mean, for me, the background is, most of you know I've been around here a long time. We started out, and I think it's definitely in this packet somewhere, where the current situation originally was 3,250 units, I believe, in Issaquah Highlands. We're up to 44 something, 4,500.
4,550, I think, because there was 100 transferred in from Polygon.
Right. So 4,550. So to me, and I know Shelter knows this about me quite a bit. It's about balance. I've sat here time and time again in the UVDC meetings, seeing conversions, seeing more housing units, seeing more residential, and the commercial's not coming, the office isn't coming, the mixed use isn't coming, and we're just piling and piling and piling on more residential. So that 3 units, to me, is 3 too many, unless there are some other provisions that I don't know about yet. Just throwing my cards on the table, but which is not new for anybody in this room. To me, it's about balance. We have not achieved the balance that we've been trying to achieve for 20 years. It's tilted toward residential and away from commercial and office and retail, and that's why that's why I think for a lot of people this is a contentious issue, right? I respect property owners' rights, and so I'm all for them having 3 residential units, right? And I'm all for other things too, but I have a really difficult time understanding, and maybe someone can enlighten me, how someone can build workforce housing in an area as desirable as Issaquah Highlands right now, and actually, and I know we can't get into things like rental rates or purchase price, but I don't know how you build units and make it available for affordable housing or workforce housing realistically, because I saw the art stuff happen around here. I saw people who had thousands of shares of Microsoft stock, but had a salary that fit them in the Arch program, they'd buy that house and then they flip it and turn it around and make $1 gazillion on it, right? Because there are ways around it. I don't want to get caught up in saying we're going to create all this great housing for teachers and firefighters and all these other folks for it only to become market rate homes and just add more and more homes. That's a bias that I have, and I'll admit that's a bias that I have. I have several other things I want to ask. So the build-out timeline, the build-out period is the end of September, or September 17th,
Sometime
19th,
in the middle
whatever.
of September.
What does that mean exactly, build-out? So does that mean that everybody who has land at Issaquah Highlands under the development agreement has to build out by that time, or what?
The build-out period is the time during which, so when you approve a development agreement, one of the things that comes with it is that the regulations can't be changed unless both parties agree to that change. And so, typically, will you sit still? I'm dancing with Victoria. And what happens is, in a city, typically, the city can decide to change zones, to change development standards. There's a public hearing, but it's completely the city's decision. In a development agreement, except for the building codes, everything, or health and safety, everything is fixed unless both parties agree. And so at the end of the so that gives both parties a certain level of predictability and certainty during whatever that build-out period is. Once you get past that, then one party can terminate and the rules can change.
So I think we thought of a process to deal with the undeveloped properties. So there's more in the Highlands than there is in Talus, but whatever's left as dirt when these things end, what the construct that we've proposed with the zoning and the overlay, and there's also a process piece in the code that says how you go through that process of getting your permits to actually build. So even if let's take the city surf site. Let's say they don't move forward, right? And so the development agreement ends, and there's a piece of property that's sitting there on 10th that has a certain amount of square footage that's been assigned to it. They can sell that 20 times before somebody maybe builds something there. The construct that we put in place would allow somebody at some point to buy that and build up to that square footage in any of the uses that we've identified under commercial, because that's commercial square footage on that piece of property. So that's the way I think that I would answer your question is, if anybody has undeveloped property, like both TriMet and Shelter Holdings might, there is a way for them to be able to actualize that entitlement through the overlay system and the process that we've proposed.
Okay, thank you. You talked about the 24-hour presence. I think it exists already in the Highlands. I don't think we need to build more housing to get that. It exists today. The property you're talking about here is enveloped by housing and activity and stuff going on. So I don't worry about that too much, just for the record. The one area that I would be supportive of personally, and again, I don't matter, I'm just one person, but it would be senior housing. I think there's definitely a space for senior housing. I think it reduces or doesn't add too many trips. I think there's a lot of opportunity for senior housing that's not a beautiful Timber Ridge type of environment where it can price out a lot of seniors. I love Timber Ridge, I really do, but it can price out a lot of seniors because it's a higher end environment. So I think there's definitely room for senior housing, and again, it wouldn't add as many trips. It wouldn't have the same kind of impact as other kinds of residential uses. That said, there would have to be a really compelling argument to me as to how many, when, where, et cetera, relative to all the other stuff that's going to be built within this piece of property. I'm curious if it's even feasible for a portion of this to be considered for the elementary school. I don't know if the piece of land or a component of it is large enough for that, but I don't know if that's been explored. When I talked to Lisa, I forgot to ask that question, but that could be a potential use. Let's see, we talked about housing types. I think Tia mentioned, you know, I'm that person you described. I have 3 kids. I'm empty nester now. I've got a big house that I can't fill up, but I want to stay in the Highlands, and I'll be damned if I'm going to sell my house for a great rate and spend 75% or 80% of that on a condo half the size because market rates require that. It's more than what I would have paid for my house when I moved into it. I'm going to keep my big house because it's more valuable to me than losing all of that value by going to a small. There are plenty of places I can go in the Highlands, plenty of places I can go in the Highlands where I can downsize. But it's not valuable to me to do that given the property that I own today. I think, and I know there are a lot of people in my position. So I don't agree necessarily that there aren't options. I think there are a lot of options. I think economically people choose to not make that decision because they're already in a pretty decent place. That's my view. Let's see, I'll keep my ranking going on. I've mentioned this before, but you know what we're lacking desperately, I think, in this community are, and what I would love to see in a place like this is recreation, additional retail, additional restaurants, and in particular rooftop restaurants, bars, viewpoints, you know, things to do at a higher level, take advantage of these incredible views that we have to the west and even to the south. And I think that, you know, anything that you bring forth should have some of those elements, even if it's senior housing or if you happen to get to residential in some way, which I don't agree with at this point. I believe you have to take advantage of those views, and I would be in support of that. But my main thing really is balance, and I am completely 100% comfortable right now with that being all commercial and retail and 3 residential units, and not upset the balance any further. All right, rant over. Anyone else? Okay, I think it's time to open a public comment for this. Okay, Fred, come on up, sir.
My name is Fred Nystrom. I live at 391 Southeast Sycamore Creek Lane in Issaquah for 34 years. And I've sat in your very same seats and listened to much of the same things when I was on the Planning Commission. And it was at a time when our community was wrestling with the concept of understanding this extraordinary development that became known as the Issaquah Highlands. And over the past 20 years, I've monitored it very carefully. And because it was really an experiment to see if we could mix the units and the densities and all. And I've got to say, at the end of that period of time, it's been a success. Most recently, I've been serving on the board of the Issaquah Highlands Council. And while I'm not speaking for the council tonight, I've grown to appreciate the guiding principles behind the development and the wisdom of carefully blending together the retail, the commercial, the residential, and the recreational into a whole that acts together. It may not always be perfect, Jeffrey, but it has worked very, very well. And it allows that mantra that was mentioned earlier about the live, work, play to really be actuated. I live in the Issaquah lowlands, all right? I wish we had some of the amenities that they have up there. And we would all be a better community if we did. So having said this about the success of the Issaquah Highlands, I'm really wondering why the city staff wants to mess with success. Why strip out the live from the live, work, play equation that has worked so well for 20 years? They're taking it out of this last 1,800,000 square feet, And it seems hard to understand why they would strip out the residential piece. It seems even harder to understand when you learn that this is the only parcel up there that is going from the old agreement to the new, where the residential is being taken away. Now, I'm the executive director for a nonprofit in town, and we work diligently to raise money so we can build homes for people who are low income and have disabilities. We have one in the Highlands now. So when I learn that drawing up here with the transit center, that there is no way in the future that I would have the ability to get a home near that transit center, which is the very thing that you need if you have disabilities, it makes no sense. So instead, I encourage you to take the existing zoning and the mixture that exists now and move it directly into the new, and don't mess around with it. The blending of commercial, retail, and residential has worked seamlessly for 20 years. And I don't think unnecessary tinkering with it now is appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nystrom. Anybody else like to speak at this time? Welcome.
Elizabeth Maupin. I live on Squawk Mountain at 100 Big Bear Place. I've been following some of the struggles around housing in this area. I was really impressed with what Shelter Holdings has done in terms of trying to find out what the community needs are. I wish I were seeing this kind of thing happening down here in the valley floor. What was just said about housing near transit makes a lot of sense. One of the problems that I hear over and over again in Issaquah is this thing about traffic. And if people can live above the places where they work, you reduce a lot of traffic, you reduce a lot of stress for the employees. And maybe one way of holding on to workforce housing is for the businesses in mixed-use developments to be able to buy some of the residences so that they can offer them to their employees. Then you have employees who stay with you. Right now, small business owners tell me that they bring people in and they train them, and as soon as they get well trained, they leave for something that's closer to home because they can't afford to live close to where they work. So that's part of what I see as a possible real gem for us in having some mixed-use zoning. Figure out a way that you can have workforce housing that's going to stay, workforce housing that's attached to the businesses that are there. That would be a real win-win on all kinds of sides. And for the people who can't work right there, being able, or even who can work right there, having transit close by to do the other things they need to do, man, that's great. Can we do it down next to the transit center too? Please, can you buy something down there? I am really impressed with what they're doing. I hope the city can help us find more developers who really listen to the community and try to find something that they can do with land that is so much benefit to the community. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have Debbie Zimmerman next. Did I get that right, or was it Greg?
My name is Debbie Zimmerman.
Oh, okay, Sarah. Okay.
I live at 2016 Northeast Katsura in the Highlands. We've been here just a year, so a short amount of time, but I am a teacher. I was a permanent substitute at Skyline this past year. And I can honestly say the teachers, the young teachers, cannot afford to live in Issaquah. They can't afford to live here. The plan you have is lovely. The pictures you showed of the amphitheaters and the walking spaces are beautiful. What I would suggest as you pick one of these two plans is those 3 multi-use residential, the actual impact of the number of people that would be there. Well, you'd like to say it's workforce living. It will be priced out of workforce living. Teachers will not. You can look up online public, teacher salaries are public domain, so you can see what they're making. They won't afford the condos that are there. They just can't. It's not in their budget. Working, like 2 dual income parents might be able to, but not a single young teacher. So I would ask you to consider what you're building, how many people will be in those units, and then the effect on the schools. People moving to the Highlands would like their young kids to go to the elementary school, which is already overcrowded, and I think it has 8 portable units. So their kids are going to school not in a schoolhouse, but in little trailers outside the schoolhouse. So those would be my main concerns when you're looking at the 3 multi-use residential. It's going to be young families because it's all they can afford with young kids that are going to be bused down here to the lowlands because Grand Ridge Elementary is full. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Ms. Fletcher.
I just wanted to go on the record. I live in Grand Ridge, and I just wanted to go on the record that I have agreed with everything that Jeff has said. So I just wanted to say that I've agreed with everything, all your questions. I thought everything you've brought up is everything that I agree with so far tonight.
Thank you. Give you the $10 later. Thanks so much. Done my job. Okay, Greg Fletcher. You better say the same thing, Greg.
Pretty much. Greg Fletcher, married with Sarah. We're new residents of the Highlands. We really appreciate the opportunity to come here tonight. We've attended some meetings before. What I can say to you is, as new residents of Issaquah, we are extremely happy with the vibrancy and the feel of downtown Issaquah. We are extremely happy with the vibrancy and feel of the Highlands. However, what we've heard tonight is what we've heard at other meetings we've gone to, which unfortunately talks about things like balance, and it talks about things like living and working and playing, and all that's happened are residential units. Yet the retail has a waiting list, and there's no reason why more retail can't be built. It's zoned correctly. The units that were planned for the Highlands have been already more than exceeded on the residential side. So why in the world are we talking about some of these projects? We had a developer come here and say, well, on the other side, it was much less reasonable than these people say, well, we're going to go high-density residential in Talus. We have a developer here saying, well, we'd like to do all these wonderful things, but the only way it's going to work is if we build apartments above everything. And this is going to be some kind of a magical place where people are going to live. I completely disagree with that, and I think that the time has come for the city to grab the reins and take the actions that it's taken so far, which is to build what you promised. You've already built the houses. As a candidate for mayor has said, it's done, stick a fork in it. That's enough residential. I'm sure that the commercial and that the retail opportunities in the Highlands are there. There's already a waiting list, and I'd love to see some more of that be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. Sarah.
I'll be quick. I know it's late. I want to share a personal story with you guys because I just moved here 2.5 years ago. And when I came to look for an apartment, there was nothing available. So then we have new apartments that were built. So now we have apartments that are 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom. 1-bedrooms are starting at $1,800 a month. 2-bedroom, 2-bath with a garage can be up to $3,200 a month. IHCA employs 20 employees, including myself. Not one of us can afford to live in the Highlands. So as much as I will support and help see architecturally whatever the city wants to do, we have to be grounded in reality that teachers do not have places to live. My landscapers live up in Bjorn and down past Renton and have to commute in. So if we're going to do this in any way, shape, or form, there has to be some affordable housing. I was kind of shocked to see that some of the new apartments that just went in down off Gilman have no affordable housing. Those apartments are extremely expensive and tiny, so that forces everyone out. So just take that into consideration. I'm the director for Issaquah Highlands, and I cannot afford to live there. I can't even afford to rent a house up there at those current rates. So please take that under consideration.
Thank you, Sarah. It's the last one on the list. Is there anybody else that would like to speak tonight on this final topic? Final question there? Anybody? Okay, we'll go ahead and close the public comment. Thank you, everybody, for all your comments tonight for all of these. Let's go ahead and continue the discussion. I know that I have some feedback on some of this, but would anybody like to contribute before I spout off again? Okay, so some feedback for me on this point. I agree with adding residential is going to add traffic, it's going to add trips, it's going to add school issues. There's all kinds of other things beyond the whole balancing. I have to tell Mr. Nystrom that I agree with you 100% that we've had success here and it's working and it's great. At some point, though, to me, balance is key, and we have not achieved that balance. So while it's worked great to some degree, we still need, and as Mr. Fletcher just said, and we've heard, there's a waiting list for retail, there's commercial and recreation, all kinds of opportunities that I know could go in there and do well today and tomorrow. I'm not opposed, personally, to senior housing, housing for the disabled, those folks, and even workforce housing to some degree, but I'd have to be assured 100% that it's truly workforce housing and those people can afford to live there, as opposed to, we'll build this and then it ends up being market rate stuff. And I don't know how we control that. Not we control, I don't know how that is controlled or managed. So that's my fear, is that everyone says, oh, this will be great, teach it. My daughter's a teacher. I get it. I have two working daughters. Neither of them can afford to live up in the neighborhood they grew up in, and they're not coming back to my house. But I don't know how we do that and ensure that they're able to, they're actually the ones that are going to be able to live in that place, because it's going, people, human nature is you're going to get the most for what you can, for what you have, what you can get in the market. And unless there's some way to control that, it's not going to happen. I do love the idea of senior housing. I do love the idea of helping people that need to be close to transit and that sort of thing. And I think there are ways to do that without turning to the, hey, we need a bunch of retail to make, or sorry, we need a bunch of residential to make this work. I did want to throw out, and I think I've told you this before, Gary, and by the way, I really like Gary, Eric, and Tia. There's nothing against you guys. I've just been passionate about this since the day I moved into the Highlands, right? It's been like I moved in here in '98, and we didn't get retail here until what, 2000, I don't remember the year, 11, 12? Okay.
12 or 13.
Yeah, I was told when I moved in that my kids can work in retail. No, they were in college when they were away. So I don't buy that anymore, okay? But one thing I think that, is a possibility in that area and sort of speaks to today's workforce is, I would love to either myself or have somebody explore the idea of a WeWork type of facility where you could build a beautiful office building. You could work with the Microsofts, the Facebooks, the Amazons, and everybody else who have people living up here in the Highlands. And instead of them commuting to their offices every day of the week, you work with those guys to help fund, finance, and build this facility where they get a portion of that building for their commuting workers who could work a few days a week as a telecommuter, or not from their home, but from this facility that they manage, they control, they set up whatever. I really think, and I don't mean a WeWork for just startups, I mean a WeWork type of facility for businesses that would like to reduce trips out on the regional roads, and I absolutely think there's a place for that. But I haven't seen anybody really explore that kind of facility, and I think there's an opportunity. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I want to make sure that I didn't miss anything. Mr. Nyström, you talked about why would we strip out the residential piece, and I think the question is why would we add more residential, not strip out, because we're not stripping anything out. We've added and added and added already. We don't need to add more. And the live, work, and play, you're absolutely right, but there's no work. There's very little work, and I think we need to add that. Okay.
As somebody that works from my house and has my hand on the mute button when my dog barks or my kids scream, there's a benefit to something like that. Coffee shops are loud and that kind of thing, and I think you would, with as much technology that exists out there now, would have the ability to draw in people for that type of application. The idea of office, I think, is dwindling and going away with the ability and the technology that's out there for that.
I want to add some feedback about the first option that you guys are proposing, and that is to say that I agree with statements before that you're the kind of developer that we want in our community, and we are happy to have you be a part of our community, and not all developers necessarily come to the table with what you guys have, and so I want to acknowledge that. But to want to hold in place, I don't see as an option right now. When I look at little things, lighting is a very good example because of the 20-year age on the development agreement. Dark skies is not acknowledged right now, and so the amount of light pollution alone from the Highlands could easily be reduced, and it's not able to be. That seems like a small thing, but it makes a huge impact on our region. And so there's a lot of things like that, like stormwater retention, things that are just, we've learned a lot and we can grow a lot. And so while I appreciate that you guys want to be able to move forward in a more streamlined process, and we appreciate you and your patience as we try to sort out this process and really make it desirable for both the city, the community, and for obviously the people who interact in our community, being you guys. To me, it seems it's hard for me to hear, let's just use what we've got, because I see that there's a better way. So if you guys, as the presentation continues and the dialogue continues about your proposal, if you guys are able to say, more concretely address what you may not like about moving forward, other than, of course, your second point about zoning, that would be a little bit more helpful, because the comment just saying, hey, we'd like to just keep our current development agreement doesn't seem to me to really be an option that we're exploring. So I want to be able to address your concerns without ignoring them, if that makes sense. And right now, kind of the hard stop of saying, hey, let's keep it in place, I don't necessarily see as being something that we're really looking at. So being able to utilize the better tools that we know that we have to make a better community, I know is something that you guys want to do, that we want to do, and so that's specifically comments for that, kind of that first option you guys have.
Thank you, Joy. And to add on to that, I mean, I understand why they want to keep it the same way it is, because it gives them an opportunity, and I would do this if I were you too, I just don't happen to not agree with it, is it gives them an opportunity to extend their residential footprint, whereas if it changes, that goes away. So I do understand and respect, the position that you guys have. I just don't happen to agree with it. So, and I think that was very well said, because there's so many other things other than the residential piece that I think are impacted here. Anything else?
Yes, since we were going to wrap up, I'm going to say one more thing to staff, and I know that you guys all work on different pieces and parts, and yet I know everybody is really looking at this next big thing that PPC is going to be dealing with, which is housing. We've had a lot of discussions about it. I know I've mentioned to Trish separately that when we have our meeting, I believe it's going to be Thursday, to really start looking at these pieces for the moratorium, I really want to see some hard, concrete, and creative solutions to housing. It's an issue that we know that pervades not only the workforce that we know needs to support a thriving community, but there also needs to be a discussion about people who are not in our workforce. And we've had a huge increase in homelessness populations in Issaquah, and I really want to encourage you guys to be looking at really a full picture of housing in our community, because it's easy to talk about people who make a baseline of $60,000 to $80,000 a year, and how do we make that affordable for them, because housing has priced them out, but that isn't really inclusive of everybody that's in our community. And so as you guys come to the table with this kind of next big chunk that we want to send to council, I want to encourage you to really think about all members of our community, not necessarily everybody who's just paying taxes and is interested in sipping wine at wine bars. There's other people too in our community as well.
Thank you. So at this time, I guess we just move on to, are there any other business that we need to discuss, announcements, anything? I don't know where we go from here. We have another meeting, I think, on September 19th, is that correct?
That's right.
Joint committee? Joint commission?
Yes,
Okay.
so it's both commissions. I think what we're going to do is take all the stuff we've heard. I don't know whether we will provide written responses or some charts that help answer some of the questions that have come up in terms of land uses and other code provisions. We'll get to work on that tomorrow.
So I think one question for y'all is, should the agenda be the same? So in other words, what we did tonight was we had kind of a general conversation about ending the development agreements and then 2 specific topics for each of these 2 parcels. And so if that was helpful, and I think there was at least still questions about both of those separate proposals, does it make sense to have the agenda be basically the same for the next meeting?
So I think, in particular on the shelter holdings area, having a further and specific discussion about whether or not we would want to not extend the development agreement, but whether it would be an option to create a new development agreement and what staff's thoughts are on that and kind of how we would work through that. And then the other idea of what a new zoning designation could be. So I think that would be my focus area. I understand what staff has presented is the zoning designation should be the urban villages, mixed use, non-residential, whether or not there are any options to us if we wanted to change things. So that would be my focus. I know you're not getting it. My thoughts for the discussion next time would focus around what those options are there, because it seems like this is one of the only ones where we have options. And then also the further conversation about with the end of the development agreement and the code changes that are being made, the reasonings for those, and kind of how we go through the specifics.
Right. Well, so the rationale, get that. I think the other piece about this particular property is that I think there's some context. I think there's some factual context about the development agreement, the expectations, what's already in place in the area, and that would be helpful for this conversation, and then potentially some other information related to the options that you laid out too.
Lucy, if I could add to that too, both of these situations with Talus and Issaquah Highlands are similar. They're different, but they're similar in that we're asking to go from a commercial/office or retail to a residential in areas where I think largely most residents there and people around the area don't want more residential. Now, that's not, cut and dry, but it's fairly obvious. Most people, I think, feel that way. What we're not talking about is, and while they don't own land down there, the Central Issaquah Plan is designed specifically to add that density, right? We should really be talking about why we don't want to add more residential up in this area, and that there are options for them if they want to purchase land down in the Central Issaquah plan area, because there's a lot of opportunity to build what they're talking about, both of them. And there's no reason we need to bring it to these two highly residential areas today when there are even better services and better options for transit and so forth for a lot of these things down in the CIP
Well,
area.
and I think the point that you're bringing up, Jeff, that would be worth also potentially providing as a maybe political context is having just gone, sorry, something in the eyeball, having just gone through the discussion at council regarding the 100 transfer of development rights coming into Issaquah Highlands, to some extent, this conversation has already been had. And so I think the other thing may be to try and summarize some of that so that, you know, because this is a council decision, so understanding their perspective of.
There's a lot of, I think there's a lot of clues we can offer you guys to help you understand that conversation. It's not just the polygon TDRs, it's the proposed development agreement for Bergsma, which was not approved because it was adding units to an area outside of central Issaquah. It was the proposed development agreement for Silverado, which was not approved, again, because it was a code change outside of central Issaquah. So the council has been very consistent, I think, in their messaging, which is if anybody's wanting something different, it's got to be in central Issaquah, and outside of that, what you've got is what you've got. Now, I think what both Shelter Holdings should have taken away from this meeting as well as TriMet is there may be a proposal that's maybe not on the table yet that might, you know, be something that would be supportable by the commission. And so I think that's up to them to see if they can come up with something that's maybe a little different. My suggestion would be if you're going to propose something, you do that with staff in advance of the next meeting, so we have the opportunity to actually respond to it and not have it show up as a slide on the meeting date, because that usually puts us in an awkward spot. So, but, you know, I think what we can do is help you guys understand some of the clues from previous council decisions, which might help this conversation go a little smoother.
Yes, context is very important here.
Yeah, my response to your question, Keith, is that, you know, one thing that was thrown out was 3 sessions to look at this. But there can be more. So I guess my suggestion would be to move forward is that our next joint meeting on the 19th is, again, another discussion. Hopefully after summer break is over, we're able to have something that's a little more widely attended, and we're able to continue that with staff providing more context, not only to the changes that we're looking at that we've talked about of the development agreement versus the Central Issaquah, when we look at these code amendments, but also being able to kind of get that context moving forward. But I would request that we have another joint meeting after that to actually decide this, whether it be in 4 or whatever, but we're having an additional one because I don't know that that amount of time gives the applicants that chance to be able to revise.
Right.
Especially, especially considering the disparity that's existing from the first applicant. I think that they may want a little, it may be more realistic to give them that time to be able to come back rather than saying on the 19th, what have you got? That may not give that kind of flexibility to even give them a chance to revise their proposal. So I would recommend that on the 19th we continue the discussion rather than trying to wrap it up.
We'll look at dates.
Yeah, and I would say, I'm not opposed to that. What I would say is, I don't want this thing to drag out forever, but I also don't want to rush it for the sake of getting it done. I want to do it right, but I don't think we're talking about a year. I don't think we're talking about 1 meeting, but, you know, as we saw with the rally agreement, for example, we took our time, we did it what I think was right, and we ended up with something I thought was pretty good that both sides were happy with. And I think we need to do that because we want to be good partners with Shelter. We want to be good partners with TriMet. We want to be good partners with our community. And we don't want people to resent the process and the people around it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anything else? All right. The marathon is ended at 10:04. Thank you very much.